Part 4. Pro-mask philosophy is bad philosophy. The malformed philosophical beliefs and assumptions that underlie compulsory masking. Why include this section at all? Your right to swing your fist ends with my face. Therefore you must wear a mask. There is no constitutional right to infect others. Therefore you must wear a mask. People who refuse to wear masks are selfish. Therefore you must wear a mask. Your liberties are not absolute. Therefore you must wear a mask. We're all in this together. Therefore you must wear a mask. Refusing to wear a mask violates others' rights. Therefore you must wear a mask. Rhetoric, slogans, and sophistry masquerading as philosophy. If I moved straight from explaining the science and how the psychological magic trick worked to the legal duels over masking, I would be ignoring the most important facet of compulsory masking. The science provided a pretext and a cloak. The psychology involved explains much of how most of the world came to wear masks so religiously, and the legalities provided a means of implementation and enforcement. All these aspects are very important and include some overlap, but they do not address the ideological source of the infection, which must be exposed and dealt with if any other remedies are to have real staying power. In the science sections, I explained why the belief that masks work is false. In the psychology section, I dealt with some of the mechanisms by which many people came to hold the belief that they should wear masks. My goal was to help readers rebut the conspicuous errors and arm themselves against being deceived by similar tactics in the future. The manipulative power of the tactics and techniques used goes down dramatically when targets become aware of what is going on. Principled self-awareness and critical thinking form one of the most effective broad-spectrum defenses. It helps us know when to turn off our autopilot and carefully evaluate both what is going on around us and what we are being told. It helps us decide when to say yes and when to dig in our heels and not give an inch. It also helps us discern when we are most likely being used as a means to an end. Hint, the more influence tactics and shoddy science employed, the more likely manipulation is involved. At the most, however, showing how someone came to hold a belief can only show that someone lacks good warrant for that belief. Showing that someone lacks a good foundation for their belief is not at all the same thing as showing the belief itself to be false. If you believe the Earth is a sphere because you read it in a fortune cookie, that might not be a good reason for believing that the Earth is a sphere, but your inadequate basis for holding that particular belief does not affect whether the belief itself is true or false. Trying to prove someone's belief or course of action erroneous by showing how they arrived at that belief or course of action is what is known as a textbook genetic fallacy. In this section, I address the false core beliefs that underlay compulsory masking. These false beliefs include the idea that if masks work, people must have a moral duty to wear them, and that it then becomes morally acceptable to compel their use. I hesitated about writing this more philosophically oriented section for months. I consider myself a well-informed layman, not a teacher. As such, any teaching in these chapters is meant for the purpose of supporting passionate arguments, not for browbeating or talking down to readers. But well-informed laymen can and should be competent to accurately recognize and call out nonsense when it starts coming from someone with a degree. Of themselves, degrees confer no special knowledge. They are merely a proxy indicator of specialized knowledge in narrow fields. Thomas Sowell spent an entire book describing the fallacies, arrogance, and ignorance of intellectuals and professionals who operate on the mistaken, self-serving premise that a few people with superior per capita knowledge in specific fields can and should override everyone else's decision-making power for the greater good. If no one has even 1% of the knowledge currently available, not counting the vast amounts of knowledge yet to be discovered, the imposition from the top down of the notions in favor among elites, convinced of their own superior knowledge and virtue, is a formula for disaster. The ignorance, prejudices, and groupthink of an educated elite are still ignorance, prejudice, and groupthink. More often than not, the credential held by a sermonizer is unrelated to the topic being lectured on, which doesn't stop the credentialed from making sweeping, self-refuting pronouncements like Stephen Hawking's famous philosophical assertion that philosophy is dead. Even a degree in philosophy provides no guarantee that one's overall argument is valid, though it is usually a decent proxy for verbal skill. Well-informed laymen are perfectly capable of putting out solid arguments if they put in the time and effort. Besides, never forget that we locked down, mandated masks and worse, not based on well-reasoned arguments, but based on sound bites, slogans, and moral browbeating made plausible mostly by carefully cultivated and totally unnecessary terror. The real source of the mental infection, an infection which mask wearing only exacerbated, came through primarily as the hidden premises underlying sound bites, rhetorical slogans, and loaded questions. Critical assumptions, axioms, and logical fallacies were occasionally mentioned and even directly debated on the periphery, but closer to the propulsive core which guided COVID policy, these remained, for the most part, unspoken or only implicit. Fear, force, and rhetorical sleight of hand let proponents of unexamined, false, and destructive philosophical assumptions use non sequiturs to jump our societal center of mass onto railroad tracks headed straight off a cliff. If law ceases to reflect objective moral reality, it loses legitimacy. Legal reforms based on bad or mistaken philosophical assumptions tend to be fragile and short-lived, unless they get it right by accident during trial and error. One thinks of Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr.'s famous observation that the life of the law has not been logic, it has been experience. If the unstated underlying moral beliefs and bad reasoning supporting compulsory masking are not stated directly and explicitly dealt with, then no matter which way the other debates surrounding face masks eventually shake out, the same basic issue will recur over and over with slightly different decorations every time enough people with power become convinced that a particular practice will save or lengthen some lives if universalized. Before we turn to details of the legal and constitutional cases against compulsory masking, it is essential that the bad philosophical assumptions undergirding compulsory masking be exposed and addressed. Rights and rights, a fundamental confusion. My brother-in-law and sister are two of the best and most intelligent people I know. Not only are both of them MDs, psychiatrists, but they gave up hundreds of thousands of dollars in foregone income to do medical missions in Africa for years at a time. They are also engaged, loving parents. Why bring up my immediate family? Because doing so provides a perfect example of how good people could and did get essential matters of principle badly wrong when it came to COVID. Like families around the world, we engaged in heated arguments over the response to COVID. Direct experience vividly brought to life the real-world implications of what had previously been cordial or entirely unnoticed abstract disagreements about fundamental principles. The governmental response to COVID split families along lines which often turned out to run thicker than blood. In my case, most of the vehemence was between myself and my sister. My brother-in-law got dragged in because of his eloquence. His primary contribution to our inter-sibling debate was to articulate in succinct writing one of the most foundational errors underlying the measures taken during COVID. First, people must realize that civil liberties only exist with a civilization, and not in a libertarian sense. American civil liberties only exist within the American schema. U.S. citizens, unfortunately, commonly think that by virtue of being U.S. citizens, we cannot be told that we can't do something. The patent absurdity of this is manifest by the fact that our rights only exist by virtue of being U.S. citizens, which exist only with the U.S. schema, which only exists within the context of having a federal government which exists to protect those rights. A simpler way of saying this is, you are only free because you submit to a government that mandates that freedom. In other words, your rights, your liberties, your freedoms are not something you possess because you are a human and all humans have certain unalienable rights. Instead, your rights depend for their existence on your society, the government, and those of your neighbors who at the moment are scared witless and posting to social media that anyone who doesn't stay home and wear a mask is committing negligent homicide. This pernicious but widespread error confuses and conflates the existence of rights with one's ability to exercise them. It is also a view that America's founders rightly, explicitly, and vigorously repudiated. The philosophy undergirding the American Revolution presupposed the existence of certain individual rights which have an objective existence independent of any government. For something to exist objectively means that it exists on its own, independent of any person's or any group's perception or opinion. Individuals and societies may disagree about what is right or wrong, but right and wrong are not just social constructs. A knowable realm of objective morality exists externally to ourselves. Likewise, each of us has individual rights that exist objectively, independent of government and independent of what other people or even other societies may think. To say otherwise is to affirm a form of sociocultural relativism whereby morality and your rights are dependent on the society you live in. Sociocultural relativism renders it impossible to criticize any society's morals because if sociocultural relativism is true, then there is no objective external standard by which to judge. Morality becomes nothing more than the personal preference of the most powerful or the most persuasive. Sociocultural relativism makes the Aztec institution of human sacrifice and the Spanish conquests equally acceptable. It would also validate the defense raised by German doctors on trial after World War II in Nuremberg. After all, everything they did under the Third Reich was perfectly legal, even mandated, according to their government at the time. But some things really are right and some things really are wrong. Even if every human on the planet were to fail to perceive a moral truth, whether through innocent ignorance or willful blindness, that moral truth still exists. It has been a source of bitter humor to see people deny the existence of objective moral values and duties one moment, and then turn around the next moment and assert that it is objectively wrong to refuse to wear a mask. America was founded on the belief that, regardless of what your immediate government happens to say, it is self-evident, axiomatic, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Americans are blessed enough to live in a country founded by individuals who correctly believed that our individual rights have objective existence, independent of the government, and that those rights are inalienable. Generations of Americans since that time have grappled with working out the practical implications of this belief. What we call civil liberties are simply the best way the framers of our Constitution could find to articulate those fundamental rights and principles and enshrine them into law. They did their best to ensure that the government they designed was perpetually forced to recognize these rights and constrained from perpetrating the kind of free-rein tyrannies which governments across the world plunged headlong into during the COVID crisis. The fact that most other governmental entities around the world and most of even America's authorities were grossly derelict in their duty to reaffirm and vigorously protect those liberties does nothing to defeat the contention that individual civil liberties exist independent of government. James Wilson, who holds the distinction of being the only man to sign the Declaration of Independence, sign the Constitution, and serve as a justice on the United States Supreme Court, asked and answered rhetorically, what was the primary and the principal object in the institution of government? Was it to acquire new rights by a human establishment? Or was it, by a human establishment, to acquire a new security for the possession or the recovery of those rights, to the enjoyment or acquisition of which we were previously entitled by the immediate gift or by the unerring law of our all-wise and all-beneficent Creator? The latter, I presume, was the case. Your natural God-given rights as an individual do not disappear simply because you cross a national border, or because you live in a society with laws that violate those rights. The purpose of government is to protect the rights of individuals, not to confer rights on individuals only insofar as doing so benefits the collective society. Even if one chooses to accept the slogan, "Liberty is not absolute," as a face-value argument, which on its own it is not, the natural rejoinder is that the ability of politicians and public health officials to curtail liberty is even less absolute. In the same lecture just quoted, James Wilson also cited one of the foremost authorities on English common law, Sir William Blackstone. English common law was embodied in the Magna Carta of 1215, with roots and influences stretching back even further to Anglo-Saxon, Roman, and Mosaic law. William Blackstone was the preeminent English jurist of his time, and his magisterial Commentaries on the Laws of England was essential reading for every lawyer and legal theorist of the time. His work has been quoted by numerous American founders, including John Jay, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, and the first Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall. Later American statesmen like Abraham Lincoln also quoted Blackstone, as have numerous Supreme Court rulings throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. One survey of more than 15,000 founding-era documents from 1760 to 1805 found that Blackstone was the second most cited secular author overall, and the most cited by the 1790s when the Bill of Rights was passed. "The absolute rights of every Englishman," wrote Sir William Blackstone, are, in a political and extensive sense, usually called their liberties. This makes Blackstone's commentaries a natural starting point for examining the absolute, unalienable rights that got trampled by the COVID response in general and by compulsory masking in particular. In his commentaries, Blackstone distinguishes between absolute rights that every human possesses by nature and relative rights that arise from the specific circumstances of a society. Blackstone begins his commentaries by defining these absolute rights in Book 1 of the Rights of Persons, Chapter 1 of the Absolute Rights of Individuals. These may be reduced to three principal or primary articles: the right of personal security, the right of personal liberty, and the right of private property. The right of personal security consists in a person's legal and uninterrupted enjoyment of his life, his limbs, his body, his health, and his reputation. Personal liberty consists in the power of locomotion, of changing situation, or removing one's person to whatsoever place one's own inclination may direct, without imprisonment or restraint unless by due course of law. It cannot ever be abridged at the mere discretion of the magistrate, without the explicit permission of the laws. Here again the language of the Great Charter is that no freeman shall be taken or imprisoned but by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land. The confinement of the person in any wise is an imprisonment, so that the keeping a man against his will in a private house, putting him in the stocks, arresting or forcibly detaining him in the street, is an imprisonment. The third absolute right, inherent in every Englishman, is that of property, which consists in the free use, enjoyment, and disposal of all his acquisitions, without any control or diminution save only by the laws of the land. You do not need to be a biologist to tell a man from a woman. You do not need to be a veterinarian to tell a dog from a cat, and you do not need to be a visionary or someone with special legal training to see that during the COVID crisis, all three of these elemental rights were repeatedly and flagrantly violated at the panic or power-driven whims of magistrates, governors, mayors, judges, public health officials, and petty bureaucrats of every type. In many places, these basic human rights are still being routinely violated on the same or similar pretexts. Blackstone's jurisprudence, while foundational, was nevertheless imperfect and drew criticism. On the one hand, proto-utilitarians like his contemporary Jeremy Bentham went after Blackstone's work from the starting point that it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. More on the problems with utilitarianism later. On the other hand, while Blackstone affirmed absolute individual rights, his definitions and elaborations included caveats which weakened those rights to the point where, in practice, they were absolute in name only. But every man, when he enters into society, gives up a part of his natural liberty as the price of so valuable a purchase, and in consideration of receiving the advantages of mutual commerce, obliges himself to conform to those laws which the community has thought proper to establish. The law which restrains a man from doing mischief to his fellow citizens, though it diminishes the natural, increases the civil liberty of mankind. America's founders learned from painful lived experience that generalized caveats and circumspection of individual rights would inevitably be abused by rulers who claimed the authority to make law, whether in the form of Parliament, King George III, or their deputies. The Founding Fathers' cornerstone written responses were the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, which explicitly codified a broader, stronger view and protection of natural rights than Blackstone articulated. James Wilson countered Blackstone's assertion that men gave up some of their natural rights when they entered society by using a rhetorical question to point out, with the medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas, that even in a state of nature, men never possessed the right to do mischief to anyone in the first place. America's founders asserted collective liberty to protect individual liberty. Ironically, a major objection to the Bill of Rights was the contention that it actually undermined the notion of limited government and individual rights, because the very existence of a document reserving specific fundamental rights to individuals implied that everything not listed was somehow surrendered. Alexander Hamilton raised this objection in Federalist 84. The people surrender nothing, and as they retain everything, they have no need of particular reservations. Bills of rights, in the sense and to the extent in which they are contended for, are not only unnecessary in the proposed Constitution, but would even be dangerous. They would contain various exceptions to powers not granted, and on this very account would afford a colorable pretext to claim more than were granted. For why declare that things shall not be done which there is no power to do? Why, for instance, should it be said that the liberty of the press shall not be restrained, when no power is given by which restrictions may be imposed? The belief that liberties, civil or otherwise, only exist because one lives in a particular society, or that one's right to do something only comes from the government, are just two of the false premises underlying compulsory masking. While some peripheral rights do indeed come into being as a product of citizenship, Americans and all people across the globe also possess certain inalienable fundamental rights which were trampled during COVID. These rights exist objectively, are God-given, or for the non-theist, natural, inalienable, and inhere in all members of mankind, regardless of national borders. A more moderate iteration of the mistaken belief above, that the government exists to temper individuals' actions so as to assure that the public is protected, is partially true if by the public one means other individuals, but this does not extend to things like compulsory masking. In his book, Principles for a Free Society, Reconciling Individual Liberty with the Common Good, legal scholar Richard Epstein, who has no connection whatsoever to the Epstein that owned an island prior to not hanging himself, says something very similar. Social obligations have to be structured to limit the risk of unbridled self-interest threatening the welfare of all individuals. However, as he explains, there are some serious qualifiers to this concept of social obligation. The proper standard of the common good does not only authorize state action, it also hems it in. The forces that link individual liberty to the common good are far stronger than those that seemingly drive them apart. A sound legal order is one that responds to the fragility of knowledge by giving no one absolute control and power. It seeks the dispersion of power across individuals and social groups. A proper understanding of the common good serves to limit government action as much or more than it permits the government to act. Government exists to secure individuals' rights against one another and from outside aggression. Outside aggression or unbridled self-interest may originate from other individuals, groups of individuals, or the government itself. An essential role of government is to temper the actions of the mob so that individuals are not unjustly deprived of their rights by mob action, say, for example, hypothetically speaking, during a mass panic. This is true even or especially when the size of the mob grows to include a majority of the population. As the father of the Constitution, James Madison, said in his 1792 essay on property, "Government is instituted to protect property of every sort, as well as that which lies in the various rights of individuals, as that which the term particularly expresses. This being the end of government, that alone is a just government which impartially secures to every man whatever is his own." Ironically, much of the destruction of actual individual rights during the COVID crisis was done under the cover of rhetoric which either asserted non-existent rights or overextended real ones. Thomas Sowell succinctly summarized this process back in 2011. Much advocacy by intellectuals involves assertions of rights for which no basis is asked or given. Neither constitutional provisions, legislative enactments, contractual obligations, nor international treaties are cited as bases for these rights. Thus there are said to be rights to a living wage, decent housing, affordable health care, and numerous other benefits, material and psychic. That such things may be desirable is not the issue. The real issue is why such things are regarded as obligations, the logical corollary of rights, upon other people who have agreed to no such obligation to provide these things. If someone has a right, someone else has an obligation. Foremost among the newly discovered rights invoked during the COVID crisis were health, especially public health, and open-ended safety. "Health is a fundamental human right," proclaimed World Health Organization Director General Tedros Ghebreyesus in 2017, 3 years prior to COVID. Everyone subjected to any manner of discrimination or duress for the purpose of coercing their mask wearing or vaccination will no doubt be relieved to find out that, in the same article, Ghebreyesus specified that the right to health also means that everyone should be entitled to control their own health and body, free from violence and discrimination. Apparently, a lot of people, including Ghebreyesus himself, missed that part of their own memo. The right to control one's own body certainly exists, but it does not come from any general open-ended right to optimal health. Saying we have a right to health is like saying that we have a right not to get sick. It's just malformed. The basis on which health and safety could be declared rights was, of course, never articulated. It was simply taken as an a priori given. A frequently used tactic was and is to simply insert these newly created rights into a list of actual rights, thereby giving them a veneer of legitimacy via simple association. People who objected, or who asked why, exactly, the right to health and safety would demand measures like compulsory universal mask wearing, found themselves on the receiving end of that classic rebuttal favored by those who resent having their positions challenged: vitriolic ad hominem attacks. We have seen there is an unquestionable individual right of personal security which all humans possess, and this includes the right of self-preservation. As America's fifth president and last founding father, James Monroe, said when addressing Congress in 1818, "The right of self-defense never ceases. It is among the most sacred, and alike necessary to nations and to individuals." The American Second Amendment takes this as a given, for the right to self-preservation includes the right of self-defense, which in turn entails the right to possess the means of self-defense. However, to say that the rights of personal security and self-preservation imply the two much broader and often conveniently vague rights to health or safety is to indefensibly overextend them. My right to property includes the right to work and dispose of my earnings without being robbed, but this does not imply that others have a legal or moral obligation to provide me with employment or forego competing with me for a job. My right of personal security does not include the right to preemptively disarm one of my neighbors, much less every neighbor, who has not done me any harm and has not displayed both a means and intention of imminently doing so. In a similar vein, my right to not be assaulted or robbed does not imply that my neighbor has a general moral or legal obligation to purchase a weapon, act as my bodyguard, or even install a security camera on his property. It also does not imply that my neighbor has a moral or legal obligation to protect himself, even if his doing so may benefit me indirectly. To try to use the right of personal security or self-preservation so broadly and preemptively is a gross overextension. Lockdowns and mask mandates went even further. Lockdowns and mask mandates implicitly assumed a broad, nonsensical right not to get sick, which was somehow enforceable on everyone else, superseding multiple pre-existing actual rights to personal security, personal liberty, and personal property. Even presuming for the sake of argument that masks work, my right to personal security does not entail that other people have a moral or legal obligation to wear a mask on the rationale that doing so might indirectly benefit myself or someone else I care about. My neighbor's right of personal security entails the right to not have something forced into his body, onto his body, or taken from his body against his will. In the same way, my right of personal security includes no component by which I can justify violating my neighbor's absolute right of personal property by forcing him to give up his job, stay at home, or wear a mask based merely on the presence of some disease in the community which he may or may not have. This remains true no matter how frightening or dangerous such a disease may be to me personally, how widespread it may be in the community, or how artfully and incessantly details about that disease happen to be presented. My neighbor is not responsible for my health, and vice versa. Similarly, we do not mandate blood and bone marrow donations for good reason. Your body is your most fundamental property, and your right to its use exceeds any claim which society may exert. The same principles that preclude involuntary servitude or mandating blood, bone marrow, tissue, and organ donations also preclude mandating masks, vaccines, or any number of other medical interventions. My right to not be assaulted with a particular bioweapon, either naturally occurring or man-made, does not imply that my neighbor has an obligation to protect me by taking every possible precaution to protect himself. This is especially true if doing so involves him making use of a medical intervention he strongly objects to. But someone may respond that they do not consent to being infected with a virus, and therefore you have a moral and legal duty to wear a mask. Apart from being a non sequitur, this objection is misconceived. Refusing to consent to being infected with any particular pathogen at large in a world with many trillions of them is like refusing consent to be exposed to water vapor in a fog or rainforest. In the case of a respiratory virus, one might as well demand to only breathe air that has never been in someone else's lungs. I have a right to take shelter or avoid places where I am more likely to encounter such environmental hazards, but in no way does this create an obligation for my neighbors to do so as well. My right to personal security may include a right to not be knocked down by someone else, but it certainly does not include a right to demand that others do everything possible to keep me from tripping and falling. My right to take whatever personal measures I think may lower my risk of disease do not extend to deciding what personal measures others take, and vice versa, even if I or someone else stands to benefit. It is the difference between asserting one's right not to be stabbed and claiming a right to force others to do everything possible to keep you from being cut by a sharp object. What we really have is a right to not be infected through deliberate action, which perhaps extends to criminal negligence in certain specific and very limited contexts, such as maybe when someone else is demonstrably ill. But one cannot establish negligence simply by asserting that it has occurred, nor even by proving that the accused did not take every possible preventative measure. One also cannot establish negligence by appealing to what people suffering from an artificially induced panic or borderline obsession might consider reasonable, regardless of whether such sufferers happen to constitute a majority of the population. Showing that someone has a 1 or 2% chance of being sick does not even come close to reaching this threshold of proof. Unlike vaccination, masks cannot contribute to primary immunity even in theory. Any theoretical risk-benefits attributable to masking are thus interchangeable with other common COVID-19 containment methods such as social distancing, hand washing, and quarantining of the actually sick. Key takeaways. One of the fundamental errors at the heart of compulsory masking was the false belief that individual rights are granted by the government or society. The liberties that each individual human naturally possesses exist independently of whether they are enforceable or recognized by the government. America's founders repudiated the view that individual rights turn on utilitarian numbers games. The individual rights of personal security and self-preservation do not extend to forcing everyone else to wear a mask or stay at home as a preemptive self-defense measure. No aggregate community right of personal security and self-preservation does this either. There is no individual or collective right to safety or public health which can be used to override actual individual rights like those recognized in the Bill of Rights. Safety is not a right. Safety is like any number of desirable conditions, such as clean water and clean air, to which the economic law of diminishing returns inescapably applies. Despite the political appeal of categorical phrases like clean water and clean air, there are in fact no such things, never have been, and perhaps never will be. Moreover, there are diminishing returns in removing impurities from water or air. Reducing truly dangerous amounts of impurities from water or air may be done at costs that most people would agree were quite reasonable. But as higher and higher standards of purity are prescribed by government in order to eliminate ever more minute traces of ever more remote or more questionable dangers, the costs escalate out of proportion to the benefits. Depending on what the particular impurity is, minute traces may or may not pose a serious danger, but political controversies over impurities in the water are unlikely to be settled at a scientific level when passions can be whipped up in the name of non-existent clean water. No matter how pure the water becomes, someone can always demand the removal of more impurities. Open-ended commitment to safety is even more simple-minded than an open-ended commitment to clean water and air, because all safety measures, by their very nature, involve risk trade-offs. The fewer entry and exit points a building has, the easier it is to prevent unauthorized access or theft, but that same lack of portals instantly becomes a liability in the case of a fire or mass shooter. There is a wealth of evidence showing that vitamin D enhances immune function, but the sunlight necessary to produce vitamin D can also cause an increase in some types of cancer. This sort of trade-off applies to masks as well. At the end of our review of mask science in Part 1, we examined some of the trade-off mechanics associated with mask use that, on net balance, easily negate or outweigh any theoretical advantages that might be expected from looking solely at their filtration properties. A Mercatus Center research publication, The Unintended Consequences of Safety Regulation, lists safety trade-offs in several domains, including automobile safety. In the years immediately after the September 11th terrorist attacks, fear of flying and a desire to avoid the hassle caused by TSA security measures led more people to drive. If nobody flew, deaths from air travel would go to zero. But since flying is safer per mile than driving, the result of avoiding perceived dangers from terrorists in the air was a net increase in deaths because of automobile accidents. Compulsory automobile insurance laws increased reckless driving, leading to more traffic fatalities. Even airbags had trade-offs. While airbags reduced fatalities by 24% among adults, they increased fatalities by 34% among children under the age of 10. This may have represented a net decrease in deaths, but it was only achieved by shifting traffic fatality risk from adults to children. In his book, The Failure of Risk Management, author and data-driven risk management specialist Douglas Hubbard describes how many risk management programs are often based on subjective intuition that makes astrology look good by comparison. Such programs can be quite effective at reducing legal risk of fines or litigation, which is often the primary unspoken driving force behind their implementation. At the same time, however, they provide no benefit whatsoever and may even have a net detrimental impact on risks involving injury or illness. In their book, Playing by the Rules: How Our Obsession with Safety is Putting Us All at Risk, authors Tracy Brown and Michael Hanlon list even more examples of counterproductive risk trade-offs and dumb rules implemented in the name of safety. Moreover, what is true of every constituent part is not necessarily true of the whole. Simply because any particular accident could have been prevented does not mean every accident can be prevented, which makes the common bureaucratic safety goal of zero preventable harm a classic fallacy of composition. All of the authors cited above share one thing in common. They are primarily concerned with physical safety, rather than concrete but intangible injuries and harms like a loss of essential individual liberty. In Part 5, we will look more at how such a loss can rise to the level of a legally recognized irreparable injury. Our safety ended on the day each one of us was conceived, and the human mortality rate is everywhere ultimately 100%. As one commentator and data analyst bluntly but accurately observed, there is no such thing as a respiratory infection that doesn't kill some frail elderly. The COVID crisis provides an excellent illustration of how compulsively running to the government for safety from any given threat is itself a very risky modus operandi. In an essay presciently titled, Is Progress Possible? Willing Slaves of the Welfare State, C.S. Lewis anticipated our gain-of-function future even while he admonished those in his day who succumbed to fear of atomic warfare. I care far more how humanity lives than how long. Progress for me means increasing goodness and happiness of individual lives. For the species, as for man, mere longevity seems to me a contemptible ideal. I am more concerned by what the balm is doing already. One meets young people who make the threat of it a reason for poisoning every pleasure and evading every duty in the present. Didn't they know that, balm or no balm, all men die, many in horrible ways? There's no good moping and sulking about it. We shall grow able to cure and to produce more diseases. Bacterial war, not bombs, might ring down the curtain. To alleviate and to inflict more pains, to husband or to waste the resources of the planet more extensively. We can become either more beneficent or more mischievous. My guess is we shall do both, mending one thing and marring another, removing old miseries and producing new ones, safeguarding ourselves here and endangering ourselves there. During the COVID crisis, rhetoric, panic, and bad reasoning created an open-ended commitment to safety that was more costly than any virus. Compulsory masking was just one manifestation of this destructive philosophical starting point. However desirable safety may be, it must never be elevated to the position of a primary value. It must remain subordinate to the individual liberties recognized in the Bill of Rights. Safety is not, never was, and never will be a human right in the sense it was alleged to justify violations of actual human rights during the response to COVID. There is a right to personal security, but that is not the same as a general open-ended right to safety. Thomas Sowell pointed out the distinction with his usual insightful brevity. Rights from government interference, Congress shall make no law, as the Constitution says regarding religion, free speech, etc., may be free, but rights to anything mean that someone else has been yoked to your service involuntarily. For society as a whole, nothing is a right, not even bare subsistence which has to be produced by human toil. Likewise, health is neither a right nor an obligation. A right or freedom which can be used to impose an authoritarian obligation on everyone else to put something into or onto their bodies is not a real right or freedom. During COVID, this false conception of rights was used to tar people who tried to assert their actual rights with labels like selfish, entitled, dangerous, antisocial, or worse. Key takeaways. The open-ended pursuit of safety is neither rational nor realistic, because there will always be some further risk that can be reduced. The law of diminishing returns applies, and all safety measures involve trade-offs which may not be beneficial on net balance. Physical and psychological harms are not the only harms that count. Intangible harms, like the loss of fundamental rights and liberties, are often just as bad or worse. Mere safety or longevity should not be our superseding values, either as individuals or societies. False, overbroad definitions of rights were used to justify mandating masks and other anti-COVID measures. Ironically, resistance to things like compulsory masking was actually based on a more limited conception of individual rights. Misdefining freedom. At their heart, debates over freedom in the context of COVID-19, or for that matter any other pathogen, have turned on radically different definitions of freedom. Anti-maskers infringe upon the freedom of everyone else, complained an opinion piece in the Salt Lake Tribune. Anti-maskers actually infringe upon my freedom, insisted a double-masked author published in an online health forum, The Mighty. At the height of the panic, these opinions may have been held by a majority, and were given pseudo-legal force through emergency mandates and widespread social pressure. Thomas Sowell insightfully described the conflict between visions of the world which define freedom differently. This conflict of visions lies at the heart of many bitter disputes over morality and policy, including public health, masks, and vaccines. The constrained vision is a tragic vision of the human condition. The unconstrained vision is a moral vision of human intentions, which are viewed as ultimately decisive. Freedom, as well as justice, is defined differently by the two visions. In the constrained vision, freedom is a process characteristic, the absence of externally imposed impediments. Thomas Hobbes applied this concept of freedom both to man and to inanimate things. A man was not free if chained or restricted by prison walls, and water was not free if hemmed in by river banks or by the walls of a container. But where the lack of movement was due to internal causes, a man fastened to his bed by sickness, or a stone that lieth still, that was not considered by Hobbes to be a lack of freedom. The same concept of freedom continues to characterize the constrained vision today. Freedom, to Friedrich Hayek, means freedom from coercion, freedom from the arbitrary power of other men, but not release from the restrictions or compulsions of circumstances. In the unconstrained vision, however, freedom is defined to include both the absence of direct externally imposed impediments and of the circumstantial limitations which reduce the range of choice. An insistence that everyone has a moral and/or legal obligation to put on a mask to stop a disease contains the implicit presumption of an individual or collective right to the unconstrained vision of freedom. Such a presumption is also latent in appeals to a social contract, or duty to society, by which everyone can be forced to wear a mask in the name of a broader right to public health, or a freedom to not be infected. These competing visions of freedom can, and often do, overlap, but are just as often mutually exclusive. To those holding the constrained vision, pathogens at large in the community, however they were introduced, simply form part of the general circumstances that make up the tragedy of the human condition. Within this vision, the spread of disease only acquires a moral or legal component when it incorporates a mens rea or actus reus, a guilty mind and guilty act. Any form of criminal negligence under the constrained definition is limited to extremely narrow, well-defined circumstances. Failing to take one or more interchangeable preventative measures, such as mask wearing or vaccination, especially in the absence of signs or symptoms of illness, does not come close to meeting that standard, regardless of whether or not such measures have been proven effective. By contrast, to those holding the more expansive, unconstrained vision, where human intention and actions are ultimately determinative, the progress of disease through a community has an inextricable moral component. Moral or legal failures which easily rise to the level of criminal negligence are to be presumed unless proven otherwise by the exercise of all possible preventative measures, including those that have only a possible benefit. The unconstrained vision, with its broader definitions of freedom, thus tends to presume a generalized, open-ended, moral, and often legal, duty to avoid becoming infected or allowing anyone else to pick up pathogens that might have used one's body as a roadhouse during some part of their life cycle. When people use the terms personal responsibility or individual responsibility in arguments over masking, those with constrained and unconstrained visions mean two different things. Those with a constrained view mean something more along the lines that people have individual responsibility for their own health, constrained by circumstances that necessitate choosing between imperfect trade-offs. On this view, extension of responsibility for things like health tends to be limited to the members of one's intimate circle and involves voluntary mutual accommodations. When those with a more unconstrained view use phrases like individual responsibility, they are describing a responsibility borne by every individual to do what is within their power to ensure their personal health and that of every member of their community. During COVID, people who held the unconstrained vision of freedom accused those who resisted putting on masks of having a false and overbroad concept of rights and freedom. Not only do American citizens not have the right to refuse masks, they have a positive duty to wear them, chided an opinionated author published by the Washington Post in August 2020. At the same time, people who resisted compulsory masking in the name of individual liberty were manifesting the much more fundamentally narrow definition of freedom found in the constrained vision. In another one of the many bitter ironies to emerge from the COVID crisis, the broader concept of freedom was used as a justification for overriding the actual rights and liberties of those who limited their definition of individual rights to the much narrower domain of taking personal protective measures without the option of using personal or third-party coercion to force others to do the same. Key takeaways. Two different definitions of freedom and responsibility were competing in the debates over compulsory masking. The narrower view of freedom and responsibility holds that individuals are responsible for their own welfare and have a right to freedom from coercion and the arbitrary power of others, but that freedom from circumstantial and personal limitations is not a right. Compulsory masking was based on the broader, unconstrained definitions of freedom and responsibility. These hold that freedom means people have a right to certain desirable outcomes, or at least to have roughly the same opportunity to be free from specific obstacles like fear or risk of disease, and that everyone has a corresponding obligatory personal responsibility to do what they can to help achieve these broader collective freedoms. The general welfare and the public interest. At this point, proponents of compulsory masking are apt to object that there is no need to locate a right to public health in the Bill of Rights because both this right and the power to enforce it are built into the General Welfare Clause of the Constitution. This clause states, "The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States." People who put forward this or similar arguments seem to forget that the powers granted to the federal government by the Constitution are intentionally few and defined, to be exercised principally on general objects such as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, as James Madison explained. James Madison made clear in Federalist 41 that the General Welfare Clause cannot be legitimately interpreted as any kind of an unlimited commission to exercise every power which may be alleged to be necessary for the common defense or general welfare, because all the specific items alluded to by these general terms were immediately laid out in the same article, not even separated by a longer pause than a semicolon. Notably, public health in either a general or a narrow sense is nowhere to be found in that list of powers delegated to the federal government. Students of history may try to rebut this citation by pointing out that James Madison signed the Vaccine Act of 1813 into law. However, all this act actually did was authorize the president to appoint an agent to preserve vaccine matter and send it to anyone who requested some through the United States mail free of any postage charges. The claim that this piece of legislation effectively established a national vaccine institution is a massive overstatement and mischaracterization. It did not establish any federal health programs, nor did it involve mandates or coercion. James Madison's signature on the Vaccine Act of 1813 no more conferred legitimacy on overextensions of the General Welfare Clause than John Adams' signature on the Alien and Sedition Acts legitimized their blatant violations of the First Amendment. It is a testament to the founders' integrity that they avoided or corrected such violations as often as they did. Pointing to the 1813 Vaccine Act in isolation also ignores the fact that during James Madison's second presidential term in 1816, Congress killed another proposed House bill that would have used general federal revenue to create and fund a federal bureaucracy for the purpose of freely distributing smallpox vaccine throughout the United States. Thus, Americans of the founding generation directly considered and rejected measures to deal with smallpox that were taken for granted during the COVID crisis. In any event, the 1813 Vaccine Act produced a fiasco 9 years later in North Carolina, which came to be referred to as the Tarboro tragedy. The vaccine agent appointed, Baltimore physician Dr. James Smith, accidentally mailed smallpox scabs to his auxiliary receiving agent, Dr. John Ward. The label was marked with variole, an abbreviation for the Latin term for smallpox, in Smith's handwriting. Dr. Ward was either unable to read Dr. Smith's handwriting or did not recognize the abbreviation. Either way, Dr. Ward proceeded to variolate, his patients with what he mistakenly thought was harmless cowpox matter. This mistake produced a small epidemic that led to at least 60 cases of smallpox and 10 deaths by late 1821. To his credit, Dr. Smith immediately published and widely distributed a warning to physicians who had recently received his vaccines that the batch they received might be tainted. This understandably produced a public uproar. Less to either of their credit, Dr. Smith and Dr. Ward then proceeded to try to throw one another under the bus. Dr. Smith pointed out that smallpox had already been in the area. His sending had been in response to a request for assistance, and that any physician competent to vaccinate should have known the difference between smallpox and cowpox scabs without the assistance of any label. Dr. Ward riposted by pointing to the persistent presence of smallpox in Baltimore despite more than a decade of Dr. Smith's enthusiastic vaccinations. Congress responded to the popular outrage and disgust by repealing the 1813 Vaccine Act. All these historical details are relevant, but the main point here is that even if the general welfare clause were interpreted as broadly as possible, it is not in any way synonymous with or reducible to public health. The good of others and the common good cannot be reduced to public health because the general welfare encompasses a myriad of other physical components, as well as distinct spiritual and moral dimensions of just as much importance and immediacy. Individual liberty, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, and the primacy of the Bill of Rights are much larger parts of the general welfare than the incidence of any disease. Additionally, the rights of personal property, due process, freedom of association, and the presumption of innocence, to name just a few, are all more important. Forcing masks onto everyone in the name of public health effectively elevated physical harm from pathogens above all other types of harm. In the name of an imprecise, speculative benefit against one virus out of thousands, compulsory masking inflicted immediate, broad, and severe harm to others by striking at their psychology, critical thinking, and fundamental liberties. Sacrificing preeminent transcendent values and principles in the pursuit of transient risk reduction did far greater harm to the general welfare than the aggregate harm to society from the worst diseases ever could. Public health can and should take a back seat when it infringes on other non-physical yet no less concrete interests. The myopic fixation on public health and mask mandates was far more harmful to all of these essential components of the general welfare than any number of individuals going unmasked could possibly have been, even if masks worked. As U.S. District Judge Terry Doty correctly observed when striking down the federal Head Start mask and vaccine mandate, the public interest is served by maintaining the constitutional structure and maintaining the liberty of individuals who do not want to take the COVID-19 vaccine. This interest outweighs government defendants' interests. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld this ruling on the same reasoning. The public interest is also served by maintaining our constitutional structure and maintaining the liberty of individuals to make intensely personal decisions according to their own convictions, even or perhaps particularly when those decisions frustrate government officials. Yet even if these courts had ruled otherwise, those rulings would still not alter the basic truth that public health is a subsidiary good which cannot and should not trump other even more basic goods. The Declaration of Independence appealed to a natural law higher than those of any governing official, the laws of nature and nature's God. It did this to recognize and lay claim to individual rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not life, public health, and the pursuit of safety. Key takeaways. The writings of America's founders and their historical precedents teach that the general welfare clause of the U.S. Constitution does not extend to anything and everything that may benefit Americans as a whole. Public health is just one of many equally or even more important things, including individual liberty, that make up the general welfare. The individual right to control over highly personal decisions about which medical interventions to use or to forego is an indispensable component of the general welfare. Slick rhetoric turns non-action into assault. Law has this much to learn from medicine. First, do no harm. Richard A. Epstein, Principles for a Free Society, 1998. During COVID, organized medicine failed to follow its own most important principles. The first and most important of these is to do no harm. Imagine for a moment that you own a small business. One day, mobsters move into your area. You mind your own affairs, hoping to be left alone. But a few weeks later, some of these mobsters show up at your business. They tell you in no uncertain terms that leaving you alone counts as a form of protection, and therefore you now owe them routine payments to maintain this protection. The added expense of paying mobsters not to wreck your business slowly begins to bankrupt you. This, in turn, generates creeping despair but produces renewed interest in spiritual matters. So you begin attending a local house of worship. It comes as a shock when, several months later, one of your new co-religionists pulls you aside to say that you are not representing the religion well because you are not a good enough person. Your actions, like being rude to non-believers, lying to get out of volunteering, and failure to donate or participate in ministry, is turning others away from the faith. Therefore, it will be your fault when they are lost for eternity. The mobsters and co-religionists described in the imaginary scenario above are using a false equivalency to make unjustified demands. Ideally, we would all refuse to accept such bad reasoning like this from anyone. We should likewise refuse to accept it from politicians and public health officials. Non-action is not a form of protection, and neither is it any form of assault. It is another false equivalency to say that inaction is imposing risk on oneself or others. Inactions like refusing to wear a mask are not doing something to anybody. At the worst, it is refusing to do something for somebody, which is a crucial distinction. A common fallacy or rhetorical trick is to use a single sentence that everyone agrees with to imply or jump to an entirely unwarranted conclusion. Florida Circuit Court Judge John Castronakis provided a prime example in the case of face masks when he dismissively shot down an early legal challenge to compulsory masking by acerbically pointing out, "We do not have a constitutional or protected right to infect others." Like many slogans, this slick piece of verbal virtuosity does four things with just one sentence. First, it neatly conflates and equates non-action with a form of assault. It also sidesteps actual justification in the same way that someone can say, "Well, that's just your opinion," as a dodge to avoid having to defend their own opinion. Third, it fabricates an implied right to personal or public health out of thin air. Lastly, it presumes masks actually work. Often, arguments for compulsory public health measures simply start from an a priori false framing that assumes rights and choices are privileges or gifts from authorities, and that non-actions can impose risk. Thus, you get broad, unqualified assertions like those of Dr. Matthew K. Winia, director of the Center for Bioethics and Humanities, which categorically elevate matters of public health above matters even of religion, like, "Avoiding mandates to uphold the ideals of personal and religious freedom is not worth the risk to others." Saying that we do not have a constitutional right to infect others, or that unmasked and unvaccinated individuals are imposing risk on everyone else, smuggles in an outrageously false equivalency. Even if masks worked, an individual's failure or refusal to wear a mask would not actively impose a risk of death by disease on others any more than failure to give charitably imposes a risk of destitution on potential recipients. "Silence is violence" is another example of such a false equivalency slogan. Apart from being catchy, these slogans work because they contain a germ of truth. Sins of omission, failure to do what one has a moral duty to do, and criminal negligence do exist, and contrast with sins of commission, actively doing something which one has a moral duty not to do. However, these slogans completely fail to carry their burden of proof to show that a sin of omission or criminal negligence has actually occurred, and they include a further cheat by falsely equating the asserted sin of omission with a sin of commission. Attempting to justify mask mandates using slogans like, "We do not have the right to infect others," is an intellectual sleight of hand that lumps assault with a deadly bioweapon into the same bucket as the inescapable risk we all incur simply by existing in a world saturated with living microorganisms. Similarly, this type of rhetoric conflates risks that are conceivable or theoretically possible with risks that are scientifically probable. Just as risk of death is an inescapable corollary of living, anyone's and everyone's mere existence imposes a plethora of risks and benefits on everyone else. Simply because another person would benefit from some action does not magically make withholding that particular action the same as inflicting harm. To isolate one theoretical risk and use that as an excuse to infringe others' absolute rights is using rhetorical alchemy to transmute a duty to do no harm into an open-ended duty to assist. A duty to do no harm does not imply a duty to assist, much less an open-ended duty to assist. The response to COVID in general, and mask mandates in particular, twisted a duty to do no harm into an open-ended duty to assist, enforced by immoral, coercive mandates and manipulative psychology. Key takeaways. Slogans like, "We do not have a constitutional right to infect others," were used to push compulsory masking at other COVID crisis impositions. These slogans were rhetorical dodges which allowed users to get away with intellectual sleight of hand, like conflating sins of omission with sins of commission, or turning a duty to do no harm into an open-ended duty to assist. Refusing to do something for someone is not the same as actively doing something to them. Even if masks worked, refusing to wear a mask would not impose risk on anybody. The flawed hidden moral reasoning behind compulsory masking. Many people throughout history, and especially in 2020, have found the false equivalency and non sequitur reasoning described above to be highly persuasive. But why? Fear in the moment is not on its own an adequate explanation. Most popular level diatribes against those labeled anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers simply take for granted the foundational moral strength of compulsory masking and make no detailed attempt to describe or defend it. Most people advocating compulsory masking and compulsory vaccination simply take it for granted that if those measures are effective, or even merely possibly effective, in reducing disease transmission, then it is moral to force them on others, i.e. if wearing a mask reduces transmission of COVID, then it is moral to force everyone to do it. But as it stands, this is a non sequitur, meaning that the conclusion does not logically follow. Science may be able to tell you what will happen if you do something, but it cannot tell you if you should do something. If we assume, for the sake of argument, that masks work, all that follows is that fewer people would catch COVID if everyone wore a mask. The bridge that gets people from the initial premise that masks work to the conclusion that it is moral to force everyone to wear one is a primitive, intuitive form of consequentialism or utilitarianism, usually unexamined. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo espoused this in 2020 when he said, "This is about saving lives, and if everything we do saves just one life, I'll be happy." This is yet another one of the primary underlying philosophical drivers behind the arguments for compulsory masking. "If it saves just one life, it's worth it," sounds good as a slogan when everyone is scared, but involves multiple hidden premises which are taken for granted but rarely, if ever, explicitly stated or defended. The unexamined chain of reasoning usually runs something like this. 1. X works. Doing X achieves some desirable end, such as preserving, sustaining, or improving life for oneself or others. 2. If X works, then it is always good to do X. 3. If it is always good to do X, then everyone has a moral duty to do X. 4. If X is a moral duty, then it is, or ought to be, a legal duty as well. 5. If X is a legal duty, then it is moral to force everyone to do X. Willful failure to fulfill that legal duty can and should be punished. Applied to masks, this becomes 1. Masks work. Wearing a mask reduces the transmission of COVID-19 or some other disease. 2. If masks work to reduce transmission of COVID or another disease, then it is always good to wear a mask. 3. If it is always good to wear a mask, then everyone has a moral duty to wear a mask. 4. If wearing a mask is a moral duty, then it is, or ought to be, a legal duty as well. 5. If wearing a mask is a legal duty, then it is moral to force everyone to wear one. People who refuse to wear masks can and should be punished. Often, this chain of reasoning is coupled with other hidden incorrect assumptions. Two of the most common are that failure to wear a mask can only result from the worst motives, and that the legal duty to wear a mask is so important that willful failure justifies deprivation of basic human rights and exclusion from society. Rather like the way a virus infiltrates the body by hiding inside a cell while it reproduces, these unstated premises smuggled themselves into acceptance by hiding inside the space between statements everyone agreed with and conclusions that required more than what was said. This explains in large part why debates over the empirical evidence regarding masks are so heated. The above chain of reasoning never gets off the ground in the first place if X, in this case masking, does not work. Many people hold strongly to premises 2, 3, 4, and 5, and it is much more comfortable, and often intellectually easier, to keep arguments in the external, non-moral realm of physical science on premise 1. But not one premise in this entire chain of reasoning is necessarily true. Even if masks worked, premise 2 would still be false. It would not always be good to wear a mask, because slowing possible disease transmission is not always the foremost good to pursue in any given situation. If you are wearing a mask to protect yourself from a disease, you may have any number of needs or desires which mask wearing interferes with, or things that you rightly value more highly than not catching a particular disease. If you are wearing a mask to protect others, the odds are overwhelming at any given time that you have nothing which a mask would protect them from, even if your mask worked. The premise that if something is good to do, then you have a duty to do it, premise 3, is likewise faulty from the get-go. Just because it would be good for you to do something does not mean you have a moral duty to do it. Even a good act which directly results in saving lives may not be a moral duty. For example, it would be good for you to become a doctor or an emergency medical technician, and if you entered either of those occupations, you would undoubtedly save many lives. However, it would be absurd to conclude from this that everyone has a moral duty to become a doctor or an EMT. The same applies to other good occupations, like farming and construction. Everyone needs food to eat and a place to live, but this does not imply that you have a moral duty to go into either of these occupations. An individual may possibly have such a moral duty, but that isolated, individualized duty, if it exists, would depend on numerous other factors that do not apply to everyone else. The majority of specific goods that people have an affirmative moral duty to do are individualized to themselves. In the case of masks, those demanding that you wear a mask are very possibly misperceiving their own moral duty in the matter, and are even less likely to be accurately perceiving yours. If the reasoning behind compulsory masking fails with regard to things that are directly life-saving, such as becoming a physician or EMT, and also fails with regard to things that are directly life-preserving, such as growing food, then it fails even more in regards to compulsory masking, with its benefits that are indirect at best, assuming they work, and fictional in reality. The fourth premise in this faulty chain of reasoning is that if wearing a mask is a moral duty, then it is or ought to be a legal duty. Another way of saying this is, what should not be permitted. The differences between what is moral and what is legal are notorious. Just as something being legal does not necessarily imply that it is moral, something being immoral does not necessarily imply that it should also be illegal. You no more have a presumptive moral obligation to defend everyone against possible infection with a particular virus than you have a presumptive moral obligation to defend everyone against possible mass shootings, much less a legal obligation. Even assuming masks work, refusing to wear a mask no more imposes a risk of infection on others than refusal to get firearms training and a concealed carry license imposes risk of a mass shooting by leaving you less prepared to deal with one of those. Likewise, you are not imposing risk on your friends and family when you give them a ride in your car after midnight, even though car accident fatalities are much more likely to occur in a car after midnight than in a pickup truck during daylight hours. Also, masks are not analogous to seatbelts. More on this later and in Part 5. The same reasoning behind compulsory masking, if applied consistently, would dictate any number of universalized public safety or public health measures that hardly anybody thinks are feasible or a good idea. The fifth and final premise, that if wearing a mask is a legal duty, then it is a moral duty, and it is moral to force everyone to wear one, is just as flawed. St. Augustine wrote, "A law that is not just is not a law." St. Thomas Aquinas quotes and expands on Augustine, adding that unjust laws are more analogous to acts of violence, and thus impose no moral obligation. Martin Luther King Jr. echoed and referenced both St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas in 1963 when he wrote, "There are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. Additionally, law and order exist for the purpose of establishing justice. People fight bitterly over whether particular laws are just and therefore valid precisely because they agree with St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and Dr. King. The moral assumption behind many of the arguments for compelling individuals to wear masks or to get vaccinated is that if there is something which an individual can do that reduces the risk of infecting others, and thus lightens the burden of the disease for individuals and the society, then they have a moral obligation to do it. This is nothing more than a disease-specific variation of the false premise that if doing X contributes to achieving some good, then you have a moral obligation to do X. If you become a healthcare provider, that would indisputably contribute to public health and lighten the burden of disease on society, but that does not at all imply you therefore have a moral duty to become a healthcare provider. Doctors may have a moral duty to treat patients, but that does not imply that it is moral or legal to force doctors to provide care against their will, or in ways that violate their conscience. Even if, for the sake of argument, we assume that everyone has a moral duty to personally assist in preventing the transmission of any given infectious disease, it would not necessarily follow that everyone has a moral or legal duty to use any particular means of doing so, much less every possible means of doing so. Not only do slogans like, "We do not have a right to infect others," fail to carry their burden to show the absolute open-ended moral duty to assist which they presume, but they also wrongly conflate moral and legal duties. In order to establish a legal duty sufficient to justify mandates, it is not enough to establish a moral duty, and even a general legal duty to assist does not necessarily imply a legal duty to use a specific means of rendering assistance, e.g. wearing a mask. Unless you assume that someone has a duty to assist using every possible means, alternative preventive measures could be used to fulfill that duty. This alone would preclude universal compulsory masking. Every step of the most important chain of moral reasoning supporting compulsory masking fails miserably. Even if wearing a mask works and is a good thing for someone to do, that does not necessarily imply a moral duty to do so. Authority figures who violated essential individual liberties by forcing masks on everyone, and the justifiers rationalizing those actions, never showed that a moral duty to wear masks existed. They simply asserted one by brute force. Moral duty does not imply legal duty, and even if every citizen in a community had a legal duty to take affirmative action to prevent disease transmission, it would still not follow that a specific means of preventing infection could be mandated. Compulsory masking rests on two pillars: the scientific argument that masks work, and the moral argument that if masks work, forcing them onto everyone is a moral imperative. Both pillars crumble when subjected to the slightest pressure. Compulsory masking was unjust and immoral from day one. Key takeaways. Science may be able to tell you what will happen if you do something, but science cannot tell you whether or not you should do something. Getting from the belief that masks mitigated COVID to the conclusion that it was moral to force everyone to wear masks required at least 4 additional hidden steps. If masks work, then it is always good to wear a mask. If it is always good for someone to wear a mask, then they have a moral duty to do so. If wearing a mask is a moral duty, then it ought to be a legal duty. If wearing a mask is a legal duty, then it is moral to force everyone to wear one, and those who resist can and should be punished. These hidden steps are moral assumptions that science cannot provide answers to, and not one of them is actually true. Even if masks work, that does not always make wearing a mask a good thing. Just because it is good to do something does not necessarily mean there is a universal moral duty to do it. Not every moral duty should be a legal duty. Just because some requirement is a law or regulation does not automatically make it or its enforcement morally right. To retain legitimacy, laws must reflect a higher moral reality, as moral luminaries from St. Augustine to St. Thomas Aquinas to Martin Luther King Jr. have consistently held. Instead of reflecting this higher moral reality, mask mandates violated it. Flawed theories of causality, culpability, and consequentialism. Mask mandates have been frequently compared to seatbelt laws. But even some of the more thoughtful pro-mask advocates quickly and rightly repudiated this bad analogy. The obvious disanalogy is that seatbelts only protect the wearer, while the primary justification put forward for forcing masks onto everyone is that masks supposedly protect everyone from the wearer, as though masks somehow behave almost like one-way valves. Further evidence of this rationale is found in the fact that any masks with actual one-way valves allowing free flow of exhaled air were outright banned in many places during the COVID crisis. In any event, arguments for masks based on seatbelt law analogies could never be expected to convince those who see both masks and seatbelt laws as just another manifestation of toxic risk aversion and overextension of paternalistic safety culture. One might as well ban mountaineering, skydiving, and any number of far more dangerous activities that are perfectly within individuals' absolute rights of personal liberty. Alternative driving-related analogies put forward to justify compulsory masking were no better. One author in the Deseret News argued that refusing to wear a mask is more analogous to driving drunk than to refusing to wear a seatbelt. When I refuse to wear a mask in a time of pandemic, I affirm my right to act or not act, but I do so in such a way as to refuse to accept any responsibility for the consequences that my actions or inactions may bring about. In the case of COVID-19, I consent to the very real possibility that my body may be used by an external biological agent so as to bring about potentially life-threatening consequences for which I likely will not be held accountable. In such cases, then, I do not truly act, but rather am acted upon, as I consent to allow the virus to act through me, perhaps bringing about consequences which I did not directly intend. The virus is in the driver's seat, not me. This is why the seatbelt analogy is perhaps less illuminating than the analogy of drunken or impaired driving. If I were to choose to drink to the point of intoxication and then get behind the wheel, I have chosen to cede my agency to an external force, the alcohol, which then works through me and may inflict harm upon others. This analogy fails in so many ways that it turns out to be worse than the seatbelt comparison. Absent force or fraud, intoxication is entirely under an individual's control. One cannot become intoxicated simply through contact with a drunk person. On the other hand, viral infections, especially airborne respiratory viral infections, are under no such control and cannot be precisely dosed and titrated like alcohol. Compulsory masking is more like assuming that all drivers on the road are drunk until proven otherwise, and mandating ignition breathalyzers for all vehicles. God help us if that attitude ever becomes widespread. The seatbelt or drunk driver arguments for compulsory masking make use of a flawed understanding of causality. This flawed understanding of causality ignores the crucial moral insight inherent in pushback against victim blaming. Accepting risk of a particular bad outcome by failing to take every possible precaution is in no way the same as consenting to that bad outcome. This is still true even if the precaution in question has been shown to have some demonstrable preventative benefit. Failing to wear a mask no more constitutes consent to SARS-CoV-2 infection than failing to use mosquito repellent constitutes consent to contracting malaria. Similarly, crossing a busy intersection does not constitute consent to being hit by a car. Wearing provocative clothing does not constitute consent to sexual assault, mountain climbing does not constitute consent to breaking a bone, and surfing without a life jacket does not constitute consent to drowning. Taking an action with a higher intrinsic risk or refusing to take an action that might lower risk is not morally equivalent to being complicit in facilitating the harm that occurs when a risk materializes. People who favor compulsory masking may object that placing primary responsibility for a person's health onto that person is itself a form of victim blaming. But this would make the definition of victim blaming so broad that blaming anyone for how they contracted an illness could be called victim blaming regardless of how they did so. In addition to his earlier insights on the psychology of masking, psychiatrist Robert Freudenthal also elaborated on this specific error, instructing people that they need to cover their faces in a certain way, and if they do not do this, then they are behaving irresponsibly and inviting danger, and therefore bear the responsibility if there are negative consequences if they do not wear masks, is analogous to the experience that some people have, particularly women, of being instructed to cover up with the message of, if you don't wear certain clothes, you are immoral and are inviting tragedy. The critical moral insight in pushback against victim blaming is that being an important, even essential part of a causal chain of events leading to a bad outcome does not necessarily confer moral culpability for that outcome. Moreover, any outcome is itself part of an ongoing chain of events which no human can foresee the conclusion of. As philosopher William Lane Craig pointed out during a lecture on the problem of evil and suffering, one of the decisive objections to utilitarianism, which is the ethical theory that says that we should do that action which is likely to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number of people, is that we have no idea of the ultimate outcome of our actions. Some short-term good might lead in the long run to untold misery, while some action that looks disastrous in the short term may turn out to bring about the greatest good for humanity. Utilitarianism falls under the broader philosophical category of consequentialism, which is the view that an action's morality is determined by its consequences, and there is so much overlap between the two that in casual usage the words are often used interchangeably. Utilitarianism and consequentialism fail as systems of ethics because no human can ever know what the final outcome of their actions will be, and because some actions are still right or wrong even if they bring about a net bad outcome or a greater good. Bringing a child into this world remains a good thing, even though you cannot know if that child will grow up to be the next Chairman Mao or Mother Teresa. Elsewhere, Dr. Craig points out, just because the consequences of some action are good doesn't make that action right or good. The end doesn't justify the means. When a martyr voluntarily gives up his life to save others, we admire the martyr, but we don't admire the people who killed him. An alternative to utilitarianism is called a deontological view. Dr. Craig explains, by contrast, on what is called a deontological view, our decisions are to be guided by certain moral principles, which we can know to be true without having to look into the future to see the outcomes of our choices. Now, of course, sometimes the application of these moral principles will require us to consider the consequences of our actions. For example, whom shall we treat first in the plague? But that is still not consequentialism, because the rightness or wrongness of those actions is not determined just by their consequences. Even if by the vicissitudes of history, deliberately infecting someone with the disease should issue in some great benefit for mankind, it would still be morally wrong to commit such an atrocity. The assumption of those who do not see this is that what should not be permitted. That principle is false. There can be genuinely evil acts, things which should not be, and yet we, and God, can be morally justified in allowing them to occur. Dr. Craig cautions, the consequentialism to be most wary of, I think, would make achieve a greater good both a necessary and sufficient condition for permitting some, when considered by itself, evil. While consideration of consequences can be relevant factually to determining which moral principle is applicable in a situation, this does not mean that bringing about a net greater good provides enough justification for committing active wrongs in pursuit of that good. I don't think that the well-being of conscious creatures is a good guide to discovering our moral duties. Indeed, it seems to me that it leads naturally to eugenics. Ethics also cannot be grounded in the recommendations of some committee of experts, even an ideal committee of medical experts opining on mask mandates. Why think that if you could assemble a committee of perfectly rational human beings, and they all would agree that you should do some action A, this constitutes a moral obligation for you to do A? To say that we have an open-ended moral duty to wear a mask because doing so brings about the greater good of human flourishing or public health simply smuggles in consequentialism or utilitarianism using a different vocabulary. Moral obligations do not and cannot originate from committees of experts or panicked mobs, much less from panicked mobs of experts. Key takeaways: seatbelt, drunk driving, public decency, and other analogies used to try to justify compulsory masking all fail. Compulsory masking was based on a flawed view of causality and culpability, which treated failing to take preventative measures against a bad outcome as a form of consenting to that bad outcome. Accepting risk of a bad outcome is not the same as consenting to that bad outcome or facilitating it. Just because a committee of experts insists that a mask mandate is moral or ethical does not make it so. An act can still be morally wrong even if it meets the requirements of a utilitarian ethical system and brings about the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Measures like mask mandates would still have been wrong even if masks worked. Even consequentialism argues against compulsory masking. Even approaching masks using a purely consequentialist ethical framework, one which refuses to admit any individual right to conscientious objection and assumes for the sake of argument that masks work, there is still a powerful pragmatic case for honoring or at least not penalizing people, including healthcare providers, who refuse masks or other medical interventions on conscientious grounds. On a purely practical policy level, although granting conscience-based exemptions from legal obligations as a matter of course may wreak havoc with the state's ability to maintain order, the same can be said of a state that rejects claims of conscience altogether. Punishment in civil society is typically for the purposes of reform, deterrence, or retribution. But punishing someone for taking non-violent action or refusing to take an action according to the dictates of their conscience almost never serves these ends effectively. Reform is not served by punishing conscientious objectors because it is impossible to coerce belief against someone's wishes, and punishment of conduct motivated by sincerely held conscientious belief is likely to result in hardening rather than changing those beliefs. For the subset of conscientious objectors who can be successfully coerced into changing their outward behavior in spite of their beliefs, the result is in many ways even worse. In his book on Conflicts of Law and Morality, legal scholar Kent Greenawalt points out, deterrence of those who lack the will to act on their convictions exacts a terrible price. Their feeling that they have yielded to compulsion and violated their most deeply held beliefs and principles may involve profound resentment and loss of self-respect. Even if coercion is successful, someone performing a task which they have been forced into but which they believe to be immoral is simply not going to do as good of a job as they would otherwise. For example, drafting pacifist Quakers or Mennonites into a combat unit does not increase that unit's combat potential. A prime historical example of this is how members of pacifist sects conscripted into Napoleonic armies avoided using their weapons to injure or kill. This made it worse than useless to try to force them to violate their sincerely held religious beliefs by conscripting them in the first place. Using retributive punishment or trying to make an example of people who adhere to their beliefs can also be expected to fail because willingness to act against self-interest in order to do what one believes to be morally right is widely and rightly considered to be a praiseworthy character trait. That kind of strength of conviction is by itself persuasive to many observers. After all, someone willing to suffer for their beliefs is more likely to have a good reason for holding those beliefs. People intuitively recognize that acts grounded in conscience and taken contrary to temporal self-interest in the face of social punishments are far more likely to reflect external objective moral truth than acts taken merely on the basis of legalistic compliance with rules or external mandates. Cultivating the development of personal conscience and self-determination is a good in and of itself, not just a means to an end. As legal scholar Lynn Wardle commented on James Madison's famous Memorial and Remonstrance, "If men are not loyal to their duty to their God and their conscience, it is folly to expect them to be loyal to mere legal rules, statutes, judicial orders, or professional duties. If you demand that a man betray his conscience, you have eliminated the only moral basis for his fidelity to the rule of law, and have destroyed the moral foundation for democracy." Punishing people for following the dictates of their conscience undermines the rule of law because doing so highlights the distinctions between what is legal and what is moral, and if the law does not serve justice, it loses legitimacy. Thus, even on a purely consequentialist or utilitarian view, there is a powerful argument to be made that individual conscience should be honored rather than penalized when it comes to masks and other medical interventions. This fact makes the consequentialist arguments underlying compulsory masking particularly ill-considered. Key takeaways. Even under a utilitarian or consequentialist ethic, there is a strong case to be made for respecting conscientious objection. Punishing conscientious refusal to comply with compulsory masking and other mandated medical interventions tends to undermine both the specific goals and the overall legitimacy of those mandates. The founders' views of medical liberty in practice. Even most of those people who think that mask mandates are defensible will concede that there are some circumstances under which it is morally permissible to deliberately infect another person with a deadly disease. The classic example of this is the medical precursor of vaccination, variolation for smallpox, which involved controlled infections with live smallpox virus in an effort to deliberately instigate a more controlled form of the disease. Ironically, the same mentality behind trying to force everyone to wear a mask or get the COVID vaccine is the same mentality that banned people from inoculating themselves with smallpox on the grounds that doing so imposed risk on others. Of course, deliberately infecting oneself with a disease like smallpox, as in variolation and some live attenuated vaccines today, is a far cry from simply refusing to take one or more general preventative measures to avoid infection with a respiratory virus. The fact that variolation was widely practiced in America in the 1700s, albeit with localized restrictions in some areas, is an indicator of the degree to which individual medical freedom was respected. One of the most straightforward ways to ascertain what the authors of the Constitution believed about where the line between essential liberty and the public good should be drawn during times of public health crises is to look at how they handled epidemics in their own lifetimes. Much has been made of George Washington's smallpox inoculations of the Continental Army during the American Revolution or the Vaccine Act of 1813 signed by James Madison. But what is not fully appreciated is that the founders lived through multiple epidemics next to which COVID pales by comparison, yet their responses to these worst threats were nowhere near as extreme as ours was to COVID. The authors of the United States Constitution fought the Revolutionary War during a 7-year smallpox epidemic that was proportionately far more deadly than COVID-19, and this contributed to the fact that American combatants alone racked up battlefield and disease deaths totaling nearly 1% of the overall population. This is in addition to the civilian deaths and sacrifices involved in attaining American independence. It is obvious that the founders valued their God-given liberties far more highly than the cost of even a worst-case Spanish flu or coronavirus pandemic. Proportionately, one of the worst epidemics in our nation's history occurred in 1793 during George Washington's first term as president. This happened not just anywhere, but in Philadelphia, which was the capital of the United States at that time. This was the Philadelphia yellow fever epidemic of 1793. In a city of 50,000 residents, nearly 10% of the population, 4,000 to 5,000 people, died. Scenes occurred in Philadelphia that were never paralleled during COVID. Bodies were found lying in the streets. A man and wife were discovered dead in bed, their little child between them still sucking at its mother's breasts. Children were wandering in the streets, their parents dead at home. Even more instructive for our COVID experience, doctors at the time thought that yellow fever could be passed directly from person to person or through contact with contaminated items. Various towns enacted quarantine measures on ships and individuals who were actively sick, and many nearby cities and towns used their militia to actively deny entry to any people or trade goods coming out of Philadelphia. However, when we look in depth at the history of that event, what we do not see is even more telling. There were no bans on mass gatherings of less than a dozen people backed up by threats of fines or imprisonment. We do not see officials categorizing their citizens' livelihoods and employment as essential or non-essential, and then forcibly suspending all pastimes they consider to be non-essential. People within Philadelphia during the yellow fever epidemic had freedom of movement. They conducted business. They visited neighbors, both sick and well. They attended church. Pennsylvania as a whole was not locked down, much less any other state, and there were no mask mandates. Citizens in Philadelphia, actively contagiously suffering from yellow fever, were still free to choose what treatments to accept or refuse, according to their individual preferences and personal beliefs. Measures like those used during COVID appear to have never even been considered. Despite killing 10% of the city's population, the Philadelphia yellow fever epidemic lasted from just August to November of 1793, meaning it did its damage in a much shorter span of time than the initial COVID crisis lockdowns. If a disease that killed 10% of the population of the national capital and the largest city in the United States at the time did not constitutionally justify locking everything down and masking up, then how could it possibly have been appropriate in 2020 for any leadership to push this? My argument is not that the authors of the Constitution did something, therefore it was good. Rather, my argument is that the authors of the Constitution understood the meaning and practical intent of the document that they wrote. The authors of the Constitution suffered through many national emergencies, military, disease, natural disaster, you name it, all of which were proportionately far more dire than COVID-19, and they did not see those events as providing justification for suspending constitutional recognition and protections of civil liberties. Therefore, we had no business doing so in the case of COVID-19. The mentality that gave rise to the COVID response was not unique to 2020. It has been present in a subset of humans at every point throughout history, and so the Constitution of the United States lacks an emergency clause not because of accident or omission, but by design and from conscious intent. In their approach to epidemic disease, America's founders recognized far more latitude for individual conscience and discretion than did the modern medical tyrannies who used the common good as a rhetorical jackboot to force masks and other medical interventions onto and into everybody. Key takeaways. The U.S. Constitution lacks an emergency exception to the Bill of Rights not by accident or omission, but by design and from conscious intent. The authors of the U.S. Constitution lived through multiple episodes of disease that were proportionately far worse than COVID, yet they never even considered measures like compulsory masking. At the time the U.S. Constitution was drafted, individual liberty in a medical context extended to deliberate self-infection with smallpox, one of the most dangerous and contagious diseases in history. Contrast these experiences with the response to COVID, where merely foregoing touted preventative measures like masking was banned and penalized. Perverting the precautionary principle. Often, vague invocations of the precautionary principle are used to justify compulsory public health measures such as lockdown and masking. This perversion of the precautionary principle holds that if you can't prove you're not sick, or if you can't prove that not wearing a mask is safe, then you should wear a mask. However, a consistent understanding of the precautionary principle would also apply to every measure that was being made compulsory, including masks, lockdowns, and vaccines. Our knowledge is imperfect, and because we do not know how many lives proposed impositions may save, and we do not know how many lives they may take, we ought to leave individuals free to choose what risks they will accept and to make mutual accommodations, especially in situations like a plague, real or imagined. For all we know, some new and far more deadly coronavirus will come along in 20 years, and everyone who got natural immunity to SARS-CoV-2 will be resistant, but those who avoided this virus or got the vaccine will have no such benefit. That is a wild scenario, and we should not plan on it, but that is part of the point. You cannot deprive people of their innate liberties based on a worst-case scenario that someone dreams up, because such catastrophizing scenarios will always exist. Freedom to choose is valuable enough that people ought not to be deprived of it, even if their use of that freedom entails that someone who is possibly infectious may possibly expose someone else to airborne particles, which may possibly contain virions, which may possibly be viable, and may possibly cause a secondary infection, which may possibly lead to illness, which may possibly lead to hospitalization, and possibly result in death. If you want nuanced incremental trade-offs leading to a more optimal outcome, the best way to achieve that is by mutual accommodation at the individual level, based on individual health and risk assessments, not by blanket mandates and coercion. Another argument for compelling masking and other medical interventions involves invoking a version of the bystander at the switch ethical dilemma. In this dilemma, the reader is cast in the role of a bystander, watching a runaway train hurtling towards a large group of people standing on the tracks. There is a switch within arm's length, which will send the train down a different track to crush a smaller group of people. Those pushing compulsory masking and other measures argue that everyone who might be in arm's reach of such a switch has a moral and legal duty to throw that switch, diverting the train onto the track holding the smaller group of people. On this view, anyone who tries to prevent the switch from being thrown becomes directly responsible for the death or potential death of everyone on the first track. In real life, however, the number of people on each track is unknown because much of the track is out of sight, and sometimes being deliberately obscured. How the people currently on the track got there, as well as whether or not they remain there, is also outside the bystander's control. In real life, flipping the switch may involve pushing one group of people onto the track in order to divert the train's path when it hits them, but with no guarantee the train will actually change course. Everyone harmed by COVID lockdowns or coerced mRNA injections falls into this category. The real point of the dilemma is to show that in real life, no person or government has the right to unilaterally arrogate such a choice to themselves. There is a sense in which epidemics, pandemics, and public health can be likened to a battlefield or emergency room triage situation, where grim externally imposed urgent necessity compels people in leadership positions on the ground to allocate limited resources as best they can. But compulsory interventions like masks and vaccinations are entirely different. They are a deliberate, self-directed seizure of fundamental choice from those who more rightfully possess this limited level of control over that aspect of their lives. One blogger answered the bystander at the switch dilemma in the context of COVID by applying a negative formulation of the golden rule. Are you prepared to allow the government to throw you in front of the train to save someone else? If not, then demand that the government stop doing it to somebody else. A rebuttal at this point might be to argue that not mandating masks would be to unjustifiably permit deadly infections in pursuit of a different greater good, that of individual liberty. It is true that declining to actively avoid something may, at the worst, permit something to occur, but that is not the same as causing that thing to occur. Conflating these two things is bad reasoning and leads to destructive outcomes and misattribution of responsibility because it holds people responsible for things that they did not, in fact, cause. Thomas Sowell dryly observed that, "We seem to be getting closer and closer to a situation where nobody is responsible for what they did, but we are all responsible for what somebody else did." It is bad enough trying to play whack-a-mole with risk trade-offs when all the interactions involved are voluntary, but coercion adds another dimension entirely. When you refrain from interfering with people's free choices, they bear primary responsibility for all good and bad outcomes. But when you forcibly remove those choices, you take on primary responsibility, not just for the good outcomes, but for the bad ones as well. It is not some noble sacrifice to forcibly take such responsibility onto oneself against the will of those to whom such choices rightfully belong. It is the sort of hubris that has more in common with iconic evil overlords of fantasy literature, and with real-world history's worst totalitarians than any tragic hero. It is worse than the worst dereliction of social duty or criminal negligence which could be ascribed to refusal to wear a mask even if masks worked. People who argue that they do not choose to accept the risk imposed on them by people in their community refusing to make use of one or more medical interventions, personal protections, or personal hygiene measures are badly misframing the argument. Objections like this draw a false equivalency between positive actions which actually impose risk, e.g., drinking and then driving, and non-actions. To accept such an objection in favor of compulsory masking or any other measure would be to accept a pathological degree of personal responsibility for the well-being of others. Moreover, the people making this objection are already at risk and are using the existence of this risk to demand that they receive protection at the cost of harm to others. Who is being more selfish, the person who refuses to give assistance or the person who demands that assistance and forces others to provide it against their will? Just as I would still be guilty of murder if I paid a hitman rather than doing the deed myself, outsourcing the imposition of medical interventions to a third party, including government officials, would not make my actions enforcing such measures on others any less wrong. The same applies even if I ostensibly impose these medical interventions on behalf of a third party like my family. Third parties may, in any case, be totally unaware of or even opposed to my forcing such measures on others. A foresighted commentator in 2015 put it this way in the context of public health. Never before have people widely asserted that they have the right to demand that everyone around them take all possible precautions at whatever cost to themselves to make this environment absolutely risk-free. If, as the mandatory vaccination proponents contend, we can demand that everyone around us take every conceivable precaution against every communicable disease, what else can we demand of them? How about superbugs? What are we going to do about all those people who abuse antibiotics, ultimately leading to the creation of superbugs? Antibiotic-resistant bacteria are responsible for nearly 15,000 deaths in the U.S. every year, far outstripping pre-vaccine deaths for measles, mumps, and whooping cough combined. Can we not hold the irresponsible people who take antibiotics every time they have a minor infection accountable for this? Here's why not. Because your right to protect public health, whatever you think that may be given the interest-driven media hysteria of the moment, ends where my body begins. Herd immunity is not something anyone has a right to. It is a positive externality, and like other such externalities, it is not something you have a right to demand that your fellow human beings provide for you. More to the point, you do not have a right to demand that other parents impose risks on their children that they are not comfortable with in order to protect your child or anyone else's children. Can there ever be a point where spreading a disease becomes assault? Of course there can. A person who knows they are infected with Ebola, for example, stepping into a crowded subway car and proceeding to cough all over the other passengers could easily be considered guilty of assault. Not being vaccinated does not equal to being infected with a disease, far less to knowingly infecting others. Failure to take every precaution against getting a disease is hardly assault. Even in the case of a truly deadly illness like Ebola, there is no justification for forcing a particular method of prevention on those who have not contracted it, or forcing treatment on anyone who has. All that anyone has a right to do is demand that those people not infect others. Immunity acquired through natural means is every bit as beneficial of an externality as immunity acquired through artificial means. A state of non-immunity or suboptimal protection cannot be legitimately equated with a state of active and transmissible disease. Rhetorical appeals to uncertainty, the precautionary principle, or other sophisms do nothing to defeat an individual's reasonable belief that they are healthy and non-contagious in the absence of signs, symptoms, or other definitive evidence to the contrary. The fact that such a belief may occasionally be mistaken is not grounds for forcing the general population to act as though it is always mistaken. In the matter of your own health and that of your children and other immediate family members, you have much more first-hand knowledge of your medical history and risk factors than even your family doctor, much less a public health official. You certainly care more, and you ultimately have a far stronger moral and legal claim over your own body than they do, because your body is your most fundamental property. When a masked or unmasked person is simply going about their business, content to let others do the same, nothing has been imposed on anyone. Real imposition occurs when an authority makes it their business to put a mask on you simply because someone else somewhere in the community has a disease which they think a mask might retard. Even assuming that every argument in favor of wearing a mask is true, neglecting to put on a mask would remain at worst a sin of omission, while forcing one onto someone against their will is and would remain a sin of commission. At worst, it would be the difference between failing to help someone being stabbed and doing the stabbing oneself. Both can be bad, but all other things being equal, sins of commission are worse. Attempts to justify compulsory masking based on claims of community self-defense fail because the right of self-defense does not permit preemptive strikes based on the assumption that every member of a community is an aggressor. It still surprises many people to learn that in case law over the last few decades, the Supreme Court has ruled in multiple decisions that individuals do not possess a legitimate claim of entitlement to receive protective services from the police under the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause, even when the facts involved are undeniably tragic. It forbids the state itself to deprive individuals of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, but its language cannot fairly be extended to impose an affirmative obligation on the state to ensure that those interests do not come to harm through other means, nor does history support such an expansive reading of the constitutional text. If police agencies, whose motto includes to protect and serve, do not necessarily have a legal duty to protect me from direct harm by other individuals, there is no basis for myself or anyone else to claim that random neighbors have a legal duty to wear a mask to provide some theoretical measure of indirect protection from a pathogen. During COVID, failing to assist by wearing a mask was rhetorically conflated with assault or manslaughter by means of a deadly bioweapon. This false equivalency is so outrageously bad that even panic-addled mental states cannot excuse it. In a nod to George Orwell's 1984, one particularly insightful internet blogger, El Gato Malo, who we met in Part 3, coined the term risk crime to describe this mentality of demanding a right to convict for that which exists only in potential and has never been acted upon. The mere existence of each one of us creates both risks and benefits for those around us, and everything we do creates both good and bad externalities. The fact that individuals do not always make choices which lead to optimal outcomes is no excuse for depriving them of those choices, much less for placing those choices in the hands of equally flawed and fallible politicians and public health officials. Policies such as banning indoor and outdoor gatherings or closing large public parks never had any calm, educated, or rational genesis.
Constantly reminding people to stay 6 feet from each other at all times and to avoid handshakes at all costs had no more medical virtue than the practice of bloodletting. Does anyone seriously think that it is a good idea to let experts who have spent 30 years obsessing over traffic fatalities dictate speed limits? Or to let people with pathological anxiety or an unhealthy penchant for micromanagement have control over what you can and cannot do with your life? It is not the exercise of rights that should be regarded as conditional and carefully monitored, but the abrogation of those rights that needs these restraints. In their own ways, the authors C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien warned against the form of utilitarianism underlying compulsory masking, compulsory vaccination, and many other measures that compel goods of commission. In an essay against the humanitarian theory of punishment, Lewis wrote, "Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It may be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. They may be more likely to go to heaven, yet at the same time likelier to make a hell of earth." Similarly, in a 1951 letter to his publisher, Tolkien explained, "The enemy in successive forms is always naturally concerned with sheer domination, and so the Lord of Magic and Machines. But the problem that this frightful evil can and does arise from an apparently good root, the desire to benefit the world and others, speedily and according to the benefactor's own plans, is a recurrent motive." In a later draft of another letter to a fan, Tolkien described how even the wisest character in his Lord of the Rings, the wizard Gandalf, would be unable to rightly wield such a degree of power over others. Gandalf as Ring Lord would have been far worse than Sauron. He would have remained righteous, but self-righteous. He would have continued to rule and order things for good and the benefit of his subjects according to his wisdom, which was and would have remained great. Thus, while Sauron multiplied evil, he left good clearly distinguishable from it. Gandalf would have made good detestable and seem evil. In Tolkien's story, Gandalf's wisdom and humility are great enough that he consciously recognizes this truth, immediately rejects such power even when it is offered freely, and works to prevent others from seizing it. During COVID, public health officials and other authorities failed the same test miserably and repeatedly when it came to masks and other compulsory public health measures. Tolkien's characterization of the evil that comes from this will to power in the name of doing good was prescient, and C.S. Lewis nailed it when he coined the phrase humanitarian tyranny. This term accurately describes the profoundly wrong and unbelievably destructive measures forced on the citizens of virtually every country in the name of public health. Key takeaways. Compulsory masking was based on a distorted, selective version of the precautionary principle, which used catastrophizing imaginative scenarios as the basis for policymaking. Using mandates to take away people's ability to come to mutual voluntary accommodations means becoming responsible for not just the desired good outcomes, which may or may not actually occur, but also becoming responsible for all the bad outcomes too. The right to swing one's fist ends with someone else's face. Likewise, any right to public health also ends with someone else's face. Even if refusing to help someone by taking a particular precaution like wearing a mask is selfish, forcing someone to provide that help by making them wear a mask against their will is even more selfish. Having a good objective does not automatically make every measure taken in pursuit of that objective moral and right. Tyranny perpetrated with the best of motives is still tyranny. Militarizing public health provides no justification. David Walsh, an ethicist and political scientist, was once asked to define when a state has the moral authority to override a citizen's otherwise inviolable autonomy in cases of communicable disease. He responded, "When the number of deaths caused by a disease in a community outweighs the number of births." Though I think even this criteria gives too much latitude to state authorities against individual rights, on a practical level, no modern disease, including COVID-19, meets this standard. Arguably, not even epoch-defining plagues like the Black Death or Plague of Justinian met this standard. A classic argument for compulsory military service is that even a single soldier's refusal to fight in a war of great import is likely to result in an increased risk of harm to his fellow soldiers, as well as an increased risk to the safety of his countrymen. During the COVID crisis, arguments like this were repurposed and turned against those who objected to compulsory masking, vaccination, social distancing, or any of the other mandated public health measures. However, attempts to militarize society in the name of some desirable end like public health fail the tests of reason, morality, and legality. Diseases simply do not pose the same type of existential threat to a society or nation as a war for national survival. Even if the threat from a plague was truly comparable to a threat from war, the same rights of conscientious objection would still apply. America's founders, in particular, were adamant on the primacy of conscience. In 1775, at the outset of the Revolution, George Washington wrote to then loyal Colonel Benedict Arnold, "Check every idea and crush in its earliest stage every attempt to plunder even those who are known to be enemies to our cause. As far as lays in your power, you are to protect and support the free exercise of the religion of the country and the undisturbed enjoyment of the rights of conscience in religious matters with your utmost influence and authority." In a 1792 essay on property, James Madison declared, "In a word, as a man is said to have a right to his property, he may be equally said to have a property in his rights, and that conscience is the most sacred of all property." Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1809, "No provision in our Constitution ought to be dearer to man than that which protects the rights of conscience against the enterprises of the civil authority." The primacy of individual conscience even in matters of personal or national survival was itself a sincerely held religious belief for some Americans. A complaint and remonstrance from a group of these Americans, addressed to Pennsylvania's Berks County Committee, was read to the Pennsylvania General Assembly on the eve of the American Revolution in 1775. It protested the county committee's resolution to fine all those who refused military service, as such mandates violated the sacred right and property to every person inhabiting in this province who shall confess and acknowledge one Almighty God, whereby it is declared that no person or persons shall be in any case molested or prejudiced in his or their person and estate because of his or their conscientious persuasion or practice, nor be compelled to do or suffer any act or thing contrary to their religious persuasion. Therefore to wrest the enjoyment of the same from any body must be sacrilege and excite divine vengeance, and must be void in effect. These conscientious objectors cited the Pennsylvania Assembly's own recommendation from June 30th, 1775. The House, taking into consideration that many of the good people of this province are conscientiously scrupulous of bearing arms, do hereby earnestly recommend to the associators for the defense of their country and others that they bear a brotherly regard towards this class of their fellow subjects and countrymen, and to these conscientious people it is also recommended that they cheerfully assist in proportion to their abilities. The petitioners also referred to the resolution of the Continental Congress from July 18, 1775. As there are some people who, from religious principles, cannot bear arms in any case, the Congress intended no violence to their consciences, but earnestly recommended to them to contribute liberally in this time of universal calamity to the relief of their distressed brethren in the several colonies, and to do all other services to their oppressed country which they can consistently with their religious principles. Unfortunately, as with the declaration that all men are created equal, many implications of the right to freedom of religion which underpinned the American Revolution were also infringed, deferred, and/or imperfectly realized during the founders' lifetimes. Under the pressure of war, even explicit constitutional protections for the rights of conscience were repeatedly violated at a local and sometimes even a state level. For example, even though Chapter 1, Article 8 of the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776 included a specific prohibition that, "Nor can any man who is conscientiously scrupulous of bearing arms be justly compelled thereto if he will pay such equivalent," members of pacifist sects such as Quakers and Mennonites nonetheless found themselves repeatedly subject to forms of persecution including confiscation of property, attempted conscription, and even denial of the right to vote because of their refusal to engage in violence. These burdens were imposed under the dogma that the right to claim the protections of society for one's rights to life, liberty, and property depended on providing protection for society through personal military service or some equivalent. Exactly how failing to provide society with protection from outside attack gave society the right to not only forego protecting one's rights from those outside attackers, but to itself actively violate those same rights from within was usually ignored. Concerns over the lack of an explicit protective cause for religious conscience when it conflicted with other legal obligations became one of many objections raised in the ratification debates, and helped maintain the driving force behind the ultimate adoption of the Bill of Rights. As one writer who adopted the pseudonym of an old Whig put it, "What is there in the new proposed Constitution to prevent his, a conscientious objectors, being dragged like a Prussian soldier to the camp and there compelled to bear arms? Without a Bill of Rights," the old Whig said, "liberty of conscience and all other personal rights would depend on the will and pleasure of their rulers." Highlighting such violations, debates, and shortcomings does not disprove the existence of a legitimate natural right of individual conscience any more than pointing to the delay of the 13th Amendment and universal emancipation can disprove the unalienable rights recognized by the Declaration that all men are created equal. If anything, these debates show that many, if not most Americans, were aware of this right and wrestling with its implications prior to and throughout the birth of the Republic. U.S. Supreme Court decisions like Sherbert v. Verner and Wisconsin v. Yoder have not only presumed and affirmed that the right to live according to one's religious beliefs is indeed entitled to constitutional protection, but in United States v. Seeger and Welsh v. United States, the court made clear that beliefs entitled to constitutional protections are not limited to traditional definitions of religion, but can include even atheistic moral or ethical beliefs about what is right and wrong, as long as these beliefs be held with the strength of traditional religious convictions. For millions of Americans and others throughout the world, wearing a mask was and remains a violation of conscience. This makes wearing a mask, in the words of Sherbert v. Verner, a regulation to compel affirmation of a repugnant belief. This means that it takes more than simply proffering a plausible public health rationale for wearing a mask, because when rights protected by the First Amendment conflict with a state regulation, it is basic that no showing merely of a rational relationship to some colorable state interest would suffice. Pointing out that masks are a public health measure does not defeat this argument, because it is possible for a gesture or practice to simultaneously serve both symbolic and practical functions, and practical benefits do not automatically confer legitimacy in compelling symbolic speech. Even taking militarization of public health as a legitimate option, doing so would still not justify compulsory masking, or would at the very least require conscience-based exemptions. Soldiers voluntarily enter a contractual obligation to forego exercising a range of rights, including some aspects of personal security and self-preservation, under particular circumstances for a set duration of time. However, even for soldiers, courts have repeatedly and emphatically ruled that the cost of military service has never entailed the complete surrender of all basic rights. One can certainly make a much stronger case that soldiers have a presumptive moral or legal duty to assist each other than one can make for civilians, but even that would still fail to show that soldiers have a presumptive moral or legal duty to make use of a particular means to provide such assistance. A paragon example of this distinction comes from the case of Medal of Honor winner Desmond Doss, a Seventh-day Adventist conscientious cooperator who refused to carry any weapon but was perfectly willing to act as a medic. Desmond Doss volunteered for service during World War II. Accommodating Desmond Doss' sincerely held religious beliefs led to saving the lives of 75 soldiers in one day on Okinawa. This does not include his life-saving services in other battles and campaigns on Guam and Leyte. Compare this to the 80 deaths from COVID in 2020 and 2021 throughout all the armed services combined. Similarly, chaplains in the armed forces do not usually carry weapons. Citizen civilians do not lack any rights that citizen soldiers possess. If carrying a weapon in a world war is not an essential moral or legal duty for soldiers, then wearing a mask cannot be an essential moral or legal duty for all citizens during a war against a disease. If there is a place in direct combat for a soldier who refuses to carry a weapon, there must also be a place in direct patient care for even healthcare workers who refuse to wear a mask or get a vaccine. The same principles which sustain a citizen's right to various degrees of conscientious objection also uphold a citizen's right to conscientiously abstain from making use of one or more medical interventions to combat a specific disease, no matter how effective such interventions may or may not be. A citizen who refuses to wear a mask or get a vaccination is, at the worst, analogous to a soldier who refuses to make use of a particular weapon system in combat, or at the best analogous to the situation of Medal of Honor recipient Desmond Doss. I emphasize the story of Desmond Doss not just because he was a true hero whose story single-handedly refutes broad-brush claims of selfishness on the part of conscientious objectors, but also because the grudging accommodation he received was partially due to what those who came before him were willing to suffer and endure for their beliefs. Both Desmond Doss' memory and precedent deserve to be honored. Those principles his case exemplifies should be consistently applied today, and those principles require accommodating anyone who refuses to wear a mask or get a vaccine, regardless of the pathogen involved. During the COVID crisis, the same officials who had a duty to reaffirm and vigorously defend those principles repeatedly threw them to the wayside based on nothing more than unquantified, unexemplified, dogmatic assertions of public health necessity. The Bill of Rights specifically protects freedom of religion rather than public health for good reason. Matters of religion are no less important than matters of public health. Coercion is wrong in matters of religion. Therefore, coercion is wrong in matters of public health. Key takeaways. Analogizing public health programs to a form of war only strengthens the moral and legal case for requiring conscience-based exemptions. The same principles which uphold a citizen's right to various degrees of conscientious objection also uphold a citizen's right to conscientiously abstain from making use of one or more medical interventions to combat a specific disease, regardless of how effective such interventions may be. There is a place in direct combat for soldiers like Desmond Doss who refuse to carry a weapon. Therefore, there must also be a place, even in direct patient care, for healthcare workers who refuse to wear a mask or get a vaccine.
Would-be justifiers of compulsory masking. In The Lucifer Effect, Dr. Philip Zimbardo concisely describes how diffusion of responsibility and administrative evil can propagate within a hierarchy, organization, or society until it becomes pervasive. Senior architects design the broad policy and rely on justifiers to come up with new language and concepts to make immoral actions more palatable. This, in turn, allows foremen to supervise and give boots-on-the-ground orders to technicians and grunts who do the most visible hands-on enforcement and act as fall guys if necessary. Compulsory masking found so many eager would-be justifiers that an exhaustive list and rebuttal would take several books. I have selected two individuals in particular to focus on as examples because their work incorporates many of the issues that we have already covered, and because of their visibility and repeated publication in both popular-level media and prestigious medical journals, such as the Journal of the American Medical Association, the New England Journal of Medicine, Bioethics, and the Journal of Medical Ethics. Because they rest on the same core assumptions, arguments for compulsory masking and compulsory vaccination overlap so extensively that they are often interchangeable. Medical journals have been saturated with a one-sided presentation of these arguments for decades, and this editorial bias was on full display during the COVID crisis. Authors who published opinion, sometimes called viewpoint or perspective, articles in journals pushing compulsory masking in 2020 also published pieces in 2021 supporting compulsory vaccination. For example, the Journal of the American Medical Association published an article by one author supporting mask mandates in August 2020, and another article by the same author supporting vaccine mandates in October 2021. In 2020, this author's ethical case for mask mandates was just one sentence. The ethical justification for face coverings is their utility in preventing transmission of serious disease to community members. That's it. Recall the hidden chain of faulty reasoning behind this, which we covered earlier. This author also used seatbelt and intoxicated driving laws as an analogy and legal precedent for laws mandating masks. The same author's October 2021 article on vaccines, titled COVID-19 Vaccine Mandates, A Wider Freedom, went into slightly more depth. He spends one sentence summarizing the constrained and unconstrained visions of freedom which Thomas Sowell devoted an entire book to. There are at least two types of freedom: freedom from personal restraint and a wider freedom to engage in daily life without significant risk of exposure to safety hazards. The author simply asserts as an a priori given that the public has the right to engage in daily social and economic life without fear of avoidable harms. ignoring the fact that this newly discovered open-ended collective right to live without fear of avoidable harms is more a question of individual psychology than of science, ethics, or constitutionality, the author immediately wielded it to dismember the actual fundamental right of informed consent. He writes, "Certainly, competent adults have the right to bodily integrity and to make their own healthcare decisions, yet the right of informed consent has clear limits." What carefully reasoned, meticulously constructed argument did this author put forward to justify his conclusion that the limits of informed consent permit vaccine mandates? Nothing more than the same tired, predictable, rhetorical sleight of hand used to wrongly conflate inaction with assault, non-immunity with active disease, and to manufacture an open-ended universal duty to assist. No one has the right to expose others to a potentially serious infectious disease. The author of the two articles discussed above is Lawrence O. Gostin, a distinguished Georgetown University law professor. Born in 1949, Professor Gostin has sat on multiple legal and public health editorial boards, including the American Journal of Tropical Medicine and Public Health, the Journal of Law and Medicine, and the American Journal of Bioethics. His career demonstrates that a medical degree is not necessary to opine on public health in the pages of medical journals or to be elected to a lifetime membership of the National Academy of Medicine. Professor Gostin does not have a public health degree. This highlights the outrageous "where's your public health degree" double standard applied to silence dissenting medical professionals and everyday conscientious layman researchers. Professor Gostin was also instrumental in helping the CDC draft the Model State Emergency Health Powers Act, MSEHPA, in 2001 following the anthrax scare. At the time this act was drafted, the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons, AAPS, warned that it included such broad emergency powers and unilateral authority to declare those emergencies in the first place that it turns governors into dictators. Between 2001 and 2020, the vast majority of states passed some variation of this act. AAPS predictions were fully borne out during the COVID crisis, when many governors used the emergency authority conferred by the act to award themselves powers that most kings would envy. Gostin concluded his 2021 JAMA Health Forum article by saying that using every tool, including mandates to achieve high vaccination coverage, enhances freedom. This was a first-rate Orwellian equivocation, substituting the individual, unalienable freedoms recognized by the Bill of Rights with a collective freedom allowing the government to override informed consent in the name of the greater good. Arguments for compulsory masking from authors with medical and public health degrees turn out to be no better. Matthew K. Winia, M.D., Master's in Public Health, is the director of the Center for Bioethics and Humanities at the University of Colorado and served as the director of the American Medical Association's Institute for Ethics from 2000 to 2013. His positions on masks and vaccines during the COVID crisis provide an excellent example of the primitive consequentialism, selective critical thinking, paternalism, and ethical double standards at work among too many people with prestigious letters after their names. In the wake of the Supreme Court's 2022 ruling in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, Dr. Winia published a perspective in the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine in which he made a strong case for collective civil disobedience among the medical profession when confronted with laws that threaten their patients' well-being. In his 2022 NEJM perspective, Dr. Winia suggested that professional conscience protections should apply equally to physicians refusing to participate in abortions and those who are compelled by conscience to provide abortion care. Starting with the American Medical Association's Code of Ethics allowance that, in exceptional circumstances of unjust laws, ethical responsibilities should supersede legal duties, Dr. Winia approvingly cited St. Augustine and Martin Luther King Jr. An unjust law is no law at all. There is, said Dr. Winia, a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. Dr. Winia vigorously defended the principle that medically nuanced decisions are best left in the hands of individual patients and their physicians, not state lawmakers. He also argued that professional civil disobedience poses little threat of anarchy. Dr. Winia's articulation of these principles should be applauded, as well as his recognition that professional civil disobedience would undoubtedly require tremendous courage. One would naturally expect Dr. Winia to respond similarly when citizens and healthcare providers apply the same principles that he defends in an abortion context to masks and vaccines mandated by executive or administrative fiat. Instead, he consistently advocated compulsory masking and vaccination, continues to do so, and shows no patience for those who disagree. He cheered the firing of a Florida doctor who offered mask exemptions for school children, and approvingly retweeted criticism of Florida Surgeon General Joseph Ladapo's refusal to wear a mask. If his Twitter feed is anything to go by, Dr. Wynia vehemently denies conscience protections for doctors who refuse to participate in masking or who help their patients do so, no matter how highly credentialed those doctors may be. While American courts have rightly ruled multiple times that religious beliefs need not be acceptable, logical, consistent, or comprehensible to others in order to merit First Amendment protection, in the context of COVID, Dr. Wynia asserted that it is ethically justified for employers to question whether one's belief is sincere if it is inconsistently applied. I invite readers to apply Dr. Wynia's proposed standard of judgment to his own work. Apparently, the impact on public health and human life from individual decisions about whether to wear a mask or get a vaccine completely lacks the medical and moral nuances involved in getting an abortion. When former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, Karen Hughes, published a July 2020 opinion piece in The Washington Post likening non-masking to yelling fire in a packed theater or brandishing a loaded gun in a crowd, and saying that we should label failure to wear a mask as what it really is, an incredibly selfish act that puts other people's lives at risk, Dr. Wynia approvingly commented, "Better late than never for this fundamental realization." Fire in a crowded theater is, at best, a misleadingly incomplete way of phrasing that famous qualification on free speech. The original 1919 court ruling this analogy was taken from, Schenck v. United States, actually said, falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. Being both a false statement and resulting in a dangerous and harmful panic is a very different thing altogether. Applied consistently, this standard would be much more likely to condemn causing a panic in a crowded community with apocalyptic modeling projections or symbolically shouting "Plague! Plague!" by wearing a mask. In September 2021, after Floridian chiropractor Dan Bush came under criticism for writing mask exemptions, Dr. Wynia unsympathetically opined, "You can't use state-sanctioned privileges to promote private beliefs. If you do, expect to lose your license." In other words, if doctors' personal beliefs contradict the party line, they must still parrot the medical establishment's party line which they believe to be false, or else. In April 2022, Judge Catherine Kimball Mizell struck down the CDC's airline mask mandate for relying on an incorrect meaning of the word sanitation contained in the Public Health Service Act, PHSA, as well as for being arbitrary and capricious. Despite Judge Kimball's careful, multi-page analysis citing authoritative dictionaries from when the Public Health Service Act was first passed, as well as the statute's historical usage, which never came close to such sweeping mandates prior to 2020, Dr. Wynia dismissed her ruling as showing zero understanding of how the word sanitation was actually used in the 1940s when the PHSA was passed. The most charitable response to this is that Dr. Wynia showed zero understanding of Judge Mizell's decision. Dr. Wynia's views on masks and vaccines seem to involve generalizing his strong view of healthcare providers' moral and ethical duty to care into an open-ended legal duty assigned to the general public. When defending compulsory vaccination at length in a November 2021 article, Dr. Wynia made use of the same deficient arguments we dealt with earlier. His final answer to the question of what makes any public health mandate ethical, whether it's for mask wearing, social distancing, or vaccination, is the same as Lawrence Gostin's: non-action is imposing risk. For both Dr. Wynia and Professor Gostin, the vague, unquantified risk of one person harming many others, even inadvertently, provides ethical justification for limiting the choice to go unvaccinated during a pandemic. In so many words, Dr. Wynia argues that essential liberties recognized by the Bill of Rights are subservient to public health, and avoiding mandates to uphold the ideals of personal and religious freedom is not worth the risk to others that would ensue in the current environment. As though any non-zero risk of transmission is categorically sufficient to justify sweeping mandates and violations of essential liberties. Dr. Wynia also completely ruled out traditionally acquired natural immunity when he asserted that herd immunity for COVID-19 will only occur through vaccination. This is inexcusable coming from anyone with a MD or public health degree. As a side note,
Dr. Winia also cited the Bangladesh mask study and Alisan et al.'s 2020 systematic review, which Winia refers to as a meta-analysis, as evidence in favor of mask wearing. Neither of these citations is to his credit, and the Alisan literature review is a particular embarrassment, as the detailed discussion near the end of the science section on mask efficacy shows. For Dr. Winia and his co-authors, mask mandates are justified because refusal to wear a mask impinges on everyone else's liberty to breathe clean air. Meanwhile, Federal District Judge Susan Mulway dismissed a challenge to compulsory masking in Hawaii on the grounds that the right to breathe oxygen without restriction is not a fundamental right. And Federal District Judge William Conley did the same in Wisconsin, stating that, certainly, being denied air may be actionable, but being denied the cleanest air readily available does not implicate a fundamental right. In other words, according to this reasoning, mask mandates are ethical because everyone has an open-ended fundamental liberty to breathe clean air, and mask mandates are legal because you have no fundamental right to breathe the cleanest air readily available or even to breathe oxygen without restriction. Heads they win, tails you lose. Moreover, either line of reasoning, if applied consistently, could just as easily be used to strike down a mask mandate instead of upholding one. If there is no right to breathe the cleanest air readily available, the justification for forcing everyone to wear a filter of any kind evaporates. Key takeaways. Case studies of experts who advocated for compulsory masking serve to highlight many of the flawed premises we have dealt with in this section on mask philosophy. Holding prestigious positions and having lots of letters after one's name does not guarantee either careful reasoning or even intellectual consistency when it comes to things like masks. The ignorance, prejudices, and groupthink of an educated elite are still ignorance, prejudice, and groupthink. Thomas Sowell, Intellectuals and Society, 2011. The Masking Mentality in Case Law. Jacobson, Buck v. Bell, and Korematsu. The poisonous precedent set by compulsory mask wearing did not come into being out of nothing. It was a natural extension of the flawed underlying rationale and legal precedents that drove some of the worst injustices in the history of American jurisprudence. In 1944, the Supreme Court decision in Korematsu v. United States upheld the mandated internment of over 100,000 Japanese Americans during World War II, irrespective of actual innocence or guilt, on the belief that a minority of them were harboring anti-American sympathies and intentions that could get others killed. The 6-3 Korematsu decision permitted authorities to use an emergency as an excuse for taking preemptive action using the convenient and highly abusable proxy criteria of race to predict social harm and death. In his incisive dissent, Justice Frank Murphy pointed out that the court majority's decision unilaterally deprived more than 100,000 Japanese Americans of their Fifth Amendment rights, as well as the constitutional rights to live and work where they will, to establish a home where they choose, and to move about freely. Moreover, in excommunicating them without benefit of hearings, this order also deprives them of all their constitutional rights to procedural due process. During the COVID crisis, the same pathogenic reasoning underlying the racist anti-Japanese World War II mandate was applied to the population as a whole, merely substituting obsessive PCR testing, case counts, and arbitrary CDC COVID-19 community levels in place of race. Legally penalizing or constraining Americans, especially those who refused to wear a face mask or refused vaccination on the tissue-thin rationale that they might possibly be harboring an infectious virus, was a medicalized version of the Korematsu travesty. The difference is that there was even less excuse for such actions in 2020 than during World War II. Korematsu earned its place of dishonor alongside the pre-Civil War Dred Scott decision. But its other ideological progenitor, Jacobson v. Massachusetts, 1905, has been cited ad nauseum by fans of lockdown measures, mask mandates, and compulsory vaccination. In Jacobson v. Massachusetts, the Supreme Court ruled that it was within a state's constitutional police power to fine a Swedish pastor, Henning Jacobson, for refusing a smallpox vaccine. In Part 5, we will discuss the legal issues with Jacobson v. Massachusetts at length. For now, leaving aside the obvious point that COVID-19 was never even remotely comparable to historical smallpox on any metric, when we look at the history of the Supreme Court case of Jacobson v. Massachusetts and how it has been applied since 1905, it is easy to see the great evil that can be traced directly to affirming a definition of individual liberty and autonomy that is too narrow. Mandates were not needed to eliminate smallpox late in the 20th century, and there is no evidence that fining Henning Jacobson for refusing a vaccine prevented even a single case of smallpox in Massachusetts. But there is irrefutable evidence that doing so led directly to another of the most shameful episodes in American history. Jacobson v. Massachusetts was, in its turn, cited just 22 years later to support Buck v. Bell, 1927. A eugenicist ruling that resulted in the forcible sterilization of tens of thousands of poor and minority American women. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. delivered the Buck v. Bell decision. "We have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. It would be strange if it could not call upon those who already sapped the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes." Jacobson v. Massachusetts, 197 U.S. 11. The lawyer Irving Whitehead filed a legal brief to the Supreme Court supporting Carrie Buck's right to not be sterilized against her will. He cited multiple precedent cases where compulsory sterilization was ruled unconstitutional, and accurately predicted the natural consequences of ruling against Carrie Buck based on expert opinions and general appeals to societal duty, predicting, "A reign of doctors will be inaugurated, and in the name of science new classes will be added. Even races may be brought within the scope of such a regulation and the worst forms of tyranny practiced." Irving Whitehead did not have to wait until mandates in 2020 to see the accuracy of his prediction. A 1937 Third Reich legal review of race protection laws of other countries directly quoted Buck v. Bell, as did Nazi doctors' defense lawyers at Nuremberg. In the wake of Buck v. Bell, thousands of institutionalized minors were sterilized in Virginia alone, boys and girls alike. Author Stephen Trombley obtained access to Institutional Medical Board transcripts from a class action lawsuit mounted by former inmates, as well as statements provided by former inmates to the Richmond office of the ACLU. Trombley reproduced excerpts from these in his 1988 book, The Right to Reproduce, A History of Coercive Sterilization. Once victims were institutionalized, consent was easy to coerce, and when it could not be coerced, it was ignored. All of these reports are chilling, but one transcript from the case of a 16-year-old girl sterilized in 1964 is enough to show the institutional mockery that passed for due process once the inviolability of informed consent and individual liberty were bypassed in the name of public health and the general welfare. The girl was truant from school because she was a slow learner and did not like being teased by other children. She was collected by a social worker and told she was going to go on a long trip. She was then involuntarily detained for more than 3 months and given a diagnosis of cultural familial mental retardation, undetermined genetic mechanism present, before her hearing in front of the medical board that would decide whether she was to be allowed the privilege of someday getting a chance to have children. The girl's parents were not permitted to attend the board in person, which is a major red flag on its own. The girl's parents also refused to sign the papers consenting to have their daughter sterilized. The girl's mother wrote to the board pleading on her daughter's behalf. "My husband and myself are not going to sign these papers. Send her home to me for good. I am not ruining her life. Put yourself in my place. If your daughter or son was to be fixed and they wanted to get married someday, and the girl or boy could not become a mother or father, would you want this to happen to your daughter or son? Well, I don't either. I want my daughter home for good. She is a nice girl and a good girl. I am proud of her." The girl herself stated clearly, "I say if I do go home, ask the social worker to let me go home next year for good, then I'm going to go home and do what my mama tells me. I do not want to get sterilized either." The expert board's chilling final ruling was issued the same day and carried out without hesitation, against the protests of the girl and her parents. No criminal or even civil conviction necessary. The board orders that sexual sterilization be performed on this patient no sooner than 30 days from this date. Even rapists do not deprive their victims of the physical capacity to have children. Whether pro-life or pro-choice, everyone who values women's reproductive rights and essential liberties should be automatically very leery of any argument that cites Jacobson v. Massachusetts as a supporting precedent. 95 years after Buck v. Bell, another lawyer, Robert Barnes, eloquently described the resultant trajectory. This is not a slippery slope fallacy because the predictable downhill slide has already happened, and worse, because we failed to uproot and repudiate the flawed philosophy undergirding the Jacobson decision. Born amidst malaria and smallpox pandemics, the Constitution authorized no emergency exception to the liberties secured under it. The Founding Fathers understood the virus of concentrated power posed more of a threat than any biological virus ever could. The Ninth Amendment to the Constitution safeguarded all ancient rights and liberties, including the ancient tort of battery. The right against battery assured the right of every individual to the possession and control of his own person, free from all restraint or interference of others, which would be sacred and protected under the law. The famed Justice Benjamin N. Cardozo defined the doctrine as the universal right of every person to determine what shall be done with his own body. This right to informed consent incorporates necessarily the right to refuse treatment. The forcible injection of medication into a non-consenting person's body represents a substantial interference with that person's liberty. The Nuremberg Code enshrines the right of informed consent as a matter of universal law, so widely recognized that courts consider it a jus cogens legal principle enforceable everywhere. Based on these precepts, courts require clear and convincing evidence that a person poses an imminent, severe risk to others before those individuals may be subject to any forced medical care. We only deviated from this informed consent standard of medical care during the eugenics era, a diseased doctrine birthed in the medical academies of the United States at the turn of the last century as a deformed outgrowth of the then in vogue school of social Darwinism. A trio of decisions carved out emergency exceptions to constitutional liberties, including authorizing a criminal fine for not taking a vaccine, Jacobson v. Massachusetts, forced sterilization of poor and politically unprotected populations, Buck v. Bell, which relied exclusively on expanding Jacobson, and the decisions culminated in the kind of emergency exception logic that led the Supreme Court to authorize forced detention camps based on race alone, Korematsu v. United States. This trilogy of infamy sees its corpses rise again as precedents, seemingly permitting governments to reinstate eugenics-era logic across the legal landscape. Appeals to historical and legal precedents from other diseases like smallpox and tuberculosis to provide grounds for COVID-19 restrictions fail for at least two reasons, even on purely utilitarian grounds. First, smallpox and tuberculosis were demonstrably far more deadly than COVID-19. Even according to the CDC, as late as 1900, tuberculosis killed 194 out of every 100,000 Americans, and was barely edged out by pneumonia as the leading cause of death. By contrast, even including all the deaths with COVID instead of from COVID, the CDC was only able to report less than half that number throughout all of 2020, 91.5 COVID deaths per 100,000. Smallpox, with its 7 to 43% mortality rate, spent 7 years ravaging North America during the American Revolution. COVID-19 is not even in the same league as these other diseases, and so any restrictions placed on the general population to protect from COVID-19 should have been lighter than those used in the case of diseases like smallpox and tuberculosis, not heavier. Second, safeguards for individual rights when dealing with these more dangerous diseases were either not honored or totally ignored in the case of COVID-19. A short perusal of the CDC's Tuberculosis Control Laws and Policies Handbook makes this abundantly clear. The guide even provides a handy checklist, including an entire section on safeguarding rights. Not one of the items on that list was fully honored in the case of COVID-19, and most have been ignored entirely. Universal compulsory masking implicitly reverses the presumption of innocence that is supposed to be at the heart of our American legal system. It visually shifts the proper burden of proof from a potential accuser onto the accused. Just as we presume that a human is born free rather than a slave, or that someone is telling the truth until proven to be a liar, the proper default presumption is one of health rather than sickness. The mere presence of a virus in a community, even a new, contagious, or particularly dangerous virus, is not grounds for treating all apparently healthy people as active plague vectors. The presence of HIV in the gay community in the 1980s and 1990s did not justify treating all gay people as though they had active AIDS, and the presence of SARS-CoV-2 in the general community never justified treating all citizens as though they had transmissible stage COVID-19. Courts have already ruled, multiple times, that policies discriminating on the basis of HIV infection cannot withstand scrutiny even in a military setting. If this is true vis-a-vis an actual infection, bloodborne, incurable, possibly transmissible, with no vaccine and requiring daily medication and periodic blood testing, then discrimination is even less defensible on the basis of a potential infection, which, while airborne, is eminently treatable, does not require daily medication or periodic blood testing, from which total recovery is the rule rather than an exception, and which never posed a substantial threat to over 99% of the population in the first place. Lockdowns, mask wearing, and other COVID crisis mandates subjected Americans' constitutionally recognized natural rights and liberties to the most sustained invasion and occupation since Korematsu, and these violations of natural law were not unique to the United States. The public benefit of reaffirming and preserving essential constitutional rights vastly outweighs any harm to a collective interest in public health from any disease. Individuals are not collective property, and individual medical decisions must never be collectivized. For all the invective aimed at selfish individual medical choices, the collective cares far less about the results of an individual's medical decision than individuals themselves do, and experts purporting to speak for the collective have far less detailed information on which to base any such decisions. We each have the right to influence disease progression in our communities by persuasion and by the example of how we handle our own personal health. We each have no right, either singly or as a group, to unilaterally determine what diseases other people do or do not catch, even if doing so would indirectly benefit us. Trying to force such determinations ostensibly on behalf of a third party like children or the elderly is no better. Avoiding a risk and acting with caution may sometimes overlap with responsible behavior, but it does not equate to responsible behavior, and doing so with every risk would be both irresponsible and cowardly. Politicians and legislators do not stand in loco parentis for the citizens who elected them, nor can they confer this power on any public health officials they appoint. Compulsory masking revealed that paternalistic attitudes justly condemned in other contexts are alive and well, not just in the medical community, but throughout the political classes, the laptop professional caste, and an all too large segment of the general citizenry. The principle that sustains compulsory masking and compulsory vaccination is the principle that says your unalienable rights are contingent on the extent to which someone or many someones can derive benefit from violating them. Your body is only your own to the extent the communal organism does not need it. By contrast, the principle that forbids compulsory masking and compulsory vaccination is the same principle that forbids performing involuntary medical interventions, including sterilizations and experiments, in the name of the common good. In the wake of the Nuremberg trials, Pope Pius XII articulated the basis for this principle in 1952. It must be noted that, in his personal being, man is not finally ordered to usefulness to society. On the contrary, the community exists for men. Individuals do not relate to their community the way that cells relate to their bodies, entirely subordinated to the good of the whole. Forcing every citizen to wear a smartwatch or smart collar to monitor vitals and record biometric data would no doubt be immensely helpful to public health. It would also be an immense, absolutely unacceptable violation of individual unalienable rights, even if it were imposed in the name of public safety and public health during a war for national survival. The same holds true of compulsory masking for COVID or any other disease. Key takeaways. Compulsory masking was a medicalized extension of the reasoning and belief systems dominant in some of the most infamous legal rulings in American history, including Buck v. Bell and Korematsu. Responses to COVID, including compulsory masking, ignored or ran roughshod over previously established safeguards for individual rights in the context of historically worse communicable respiratory diseases like tuberculosis. Individuals in a community are not like cells in a human body. Individuals have rights that cannot be overruled by any amount of communal benefit from violating them. The right to forego making use of particular medical interventions or participating in particular medical experiments are among these. Conclusion. When compliance becomes complicity. Mask wearing, like many other practices over the course of human history, including flag salutes, is a visual slogan. Our affected mutual indifference to one another's masks was and remains a fragile illusion. In reality, by dutifully wearing our masks when ordered to do so, we reaffirm to one another not only our knowledge of the rules of the game, but pressure each other to accept those rules. As Václav Havel put it, we confirm thereby the power that requires the slogans in the first place. Quite simply, each helps the other to be obedient. Both are objects in a system of control, but at the same time they are its subjects as well. They are both victims of the system and its instruments. What Václav Havel described as a system includes what we think of as the permeating culture or social atmosphere. What we understand by the system is not, therefore, a social order imposed by one group upon another, but rather something which permeates the entire society and is a factor in shaping it, something which may seem impossible to grasp or define. Every person who wore a mask, myself included, helped to legitimize the practice and contributed, along with thousands of other rituals, to enhancing the panoramic atmosphere of pandemic emergency used to justify and perpetuate the accompanying self-destructive and immoral public health measures. As Havel put it, this panorama, of course, has a subliminal meaning as well. It reminds people where they are living and what is expected of them. It tells them what everyone else is doing and indicates to them what they must do as well if they don't want to be excluded, to fall into isolation, alienate themselves from society, break the rules of the game, and risk the loss of their peace and tranquility and security. Their slogans are mutually dependent. Both were displayed with some awareness of the general panorama and, we might say, under its diktat. Both, however, assist in the creation of that panorama, and therefore they assist in the creation of that diktat as well. This kind of complicity provides another excellent example of how and why moral duties and legal duties do not and should not completely overlap in the way mask mandates assume. It also explains why there is and ought to be a high bar for a moral duty to surmount before it can become a legal duty. This kind of complicity involves shades of gray. For individuals like myself, who recognized compulsory masking for what it was from the get-go, and who know, or like the experts claimed to know, so much about masks, it includes moral culpability. But just as moral duties vary individually, such culpability does not apply to everyone equally. The point at which compliance becomes complicity and culpability varies from person to person, as does the extent of one's moral duty to push back. There is no doubt that individual motivations at every level of responsibility for implementing and enforcing coerced masking covered the whole spectrum of motivation from opportunism or altruism to the fear, arrogance, and self-righteousness wrongly ascribed to people who refused to comply. Regardless of the motivation or intent behind coerced masking, however, the net effect was indisputably to get a disturbingly large segment of the population to, in Havel's words, participate in the common responsibility for it, so they may be pulled into and ensnared by it, like Faust by Mephistopheles. Compulsory masking was sold and pushed using malformed philosophies and pathological, boundary-violating notions of social responsibility. Because human nature does not change, the mentality underlying compulsory masking will always seek to manifest in various forms. Unless or until enough people develop the courage to, as Havel put it, live within the truth, we will be left to live within the alternative, accepting the given rules of the game, thus making it possible for the game to go on, for it to exist in the first place.